Hunter Quatermain's story by H. Rider Haggard. Narrated and presented by Golden Fiction Tales. The Spring of a Lion. Sir Henry Curtis, as everybody acquainted with him knows, is one of the most hospitable men on earth. It was in the course of the enjoyment of his hospitality at his place in Yorkshire the other day that I heard the hunting story, which I am now about to transcribe. Many of those who read it will no doubt have heard some of the strange rumours that are flying about to the effect that Sir Henry Curtis and his friend Captain Good, Royal Navy, recently found a vast treasure of diamonds out in the heart of Africa, supposed to have been hidden by the Egyptians, or King Solomon, or some other antique people. I first saw the matter alluded to in a paragraph in one of the society papers the day before I started for Yorkshire to pay my visit to Curtis, and arrived, needless to say, burning with curiosity. For there is something very fascinating to the mind in the idea of hidden treasure. When I reached the hall, I at once asked Curtis about it, and he did not deny the truth of the story. But on my pressing him to tell it, he would not. Nor would Captain Good, who was also staying in the house. "You would not believe me if I did," Sir Henry said, with one of the hearty laughs which seemed to come right out of his great lungs. "You must wait till Hunter Quatermain comes. He will arrive here from Africa tonight, and I am not going to say a word about the matter, or Good either, until he turns up. Quatermain was with us all through. He has known about the business for years and years, and if it had not been for him, we should not have been here today. I am going to meet him presently. I could not get a word more out of him, nor could anybody else, though we were all dying of curiosity, especially some of the ladies. I shall never forget how they looked in the drawing-room before dinner when Captain Good produced a great rough diamond, weighing 50 carats or more, and told them that he had many larger than that. If ever I saw curiosity and envy printed on fair faces, I saw them then. It was just at this moment that the door was opened, and Mr. Alan Quatermain announced, whereupon Good put the diamond into his pocket, and sprang at a little man who limped shyly into the room, convoyed by Sir Henry Curtis himself. "Here he is, Good, safe and sound," said Sir Henry, gleefully. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to one of the oldest hunters and the very best shot in Africa, who has killed more elephants and lions than any other man alive." Everybody turned and stared politely at the curious-looking little lame man, and though his size was insignificant, he was quite worth staring at. He had short grizzled hair, which stood about an inch above his head like the bristles of a brush, gentle brown eyes that seemed to notice everything, and a withered face, tanned to the colour of mahogany from exposure to the weather. He spoke, too, when he returned Good's enthusiastic greeting, with a curious little accent, which made his speech noticeable. It so happened that I sat next to Alan Quatermain at dinner, and, of course, did my best to draw him, but he was not to be drawn. He admitted that he had recently been a long journey into the interior of Africa with Sir Henry Curtis and Captain Good, and that they had found treasure, and then politely turned the subject and began to ask me questions about England, where he had never been before, that is, since he came to years of discretion. Of course, I did not find this very interesting, and so cast about for some means to bring the conversation round again. Now, we were dining in an oak, panelled vestibule, and on the wall opposite to me were fixed 2 gigantic elephant tusks, and under them a pair of buffalo horns, very rough and knotted, showing that they came off an old bull, and having the tip of one horn split and chipped. I noticed that Hunter Quatermain's eyes kept glancing at these trophies, and took an occasion to ask him if he knew anything about them. I ought to. He answered, with a little laugh, the elephant to which those tusks belonged tore one of our party right in 2 about 18 months ago. And as for the buffalo horns, they were nearly my death, and were the end of a servant of mine to whom I was much attached. I gave them to Sir Henry when he left Natal some months ago, and Mr. Quatermain sighed and turned to answer a question from the lady whom he had taken down to dinner, and who, needless to say, was also employed in trying to pump him about the diamonds. Indeed, all round the table there was a simmer of scarcely suppressed excitement, which, when the servants had left the room, could no longer be restrained. "Now, Mr. Quatermain," said the lady next him, "we have been kept in an agony of suspense by Sir Henry and Captain Good, who have persistently refused to tell us a word of this story about the hidden treasure till you came, and we simply can bear it no longer. So, please, begin at once." "Yes," said everybody, "go on, please." Hunter Quatermain glanced round the table apprehensively. He did not seem to appreciate finding himself the object of so much curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said at last, with a shake of his grizzled head, "I am very sorry to disappoint you, but I cannot do it. It is this way. At the request of Sir Henry and Captain Good, I have written down a true and plain account of King Solomon's mines, and how we found them. So you will soon be able to learn all about that wonderful adventure for yourselves. But until then I will say nothing about it, not from any wish to disappoint your curiosity or to make myself important, but simply because the whole story partakes so much of the marvellous that I am afraid to tell it in a piecemeal, hasty fashion, for fear I should be set down as one of those common fellows of whom there are so many in my profession, who are not ashamed to narrate things they have not seen, and even to tell wonderful stories about wild animals they have never killed. And I think that my companions in adventure, Sir Henry Curtis and Captain Good, will bear me out in what I say. Yes, Quatermain, I think you are quite right, said Sir Henry. Precisely the same considerations have forced Good and myself to hold our tongues. We did not wish to be bracketed with, well, with other famous travellers. There was a murmur of disappointment at these announcements. "I believe you are all hoaxing us," said the young lady next Mr. Quatermain, rather sharply. "Believe me," answered the old hunter, with a quaint courtesy and a little bow of his grizzled head, "though I have lived all my life in the wilderness and amongst savages, I have neither the heart nor the want of manners to wish to deceive one so lovely." Whereat the young lady, who was pretty, looked appeased. "This is very dreadful," I broke in. "We ask for bread, and you give us a stone, Mr. Quatermain. The least that you can do is to tell us the story of the tusks opposite and the buffalo horns underneath. We won't let you off with less." "I am but a poor story-teller," put in the old hunter, "but if you will forgive my want of skill, I shall be happy to tell you, not the story of the tusks, for that is part of the history of our journey to King Solomon's mines, but that of the buffalo horns beneath them, which is now 10 years old. Bravo.
"Quatermain,"
said Sir Henry. "We shall all be delighted. Fire away. Fill up your glass first." The little man did as he was bid, took a sip of claret, and began. About 10 years ago I was hunting up in the far interior of Africa, at a place called Gatgara, not a great way from the Chobe River. I had with me 4 native servants, namely, a driver and vorloper, or leader, who were natives of Matabeleland, a Hottentot named Hans, who had once been the slave of a Transvaal Boer, and a Zulu hunter, who for 5 years had accompanied me upon my trips, and whose name was Mashoon. Now near Gatgara I found a fine piece of healthy, park-like country, where the grass was very good, considering the time of year, and here I made a little camp, or head-quarter settlement, from whence I went expeditions on all sides in search of game, especially elephant. My luck, however, was bad. I got but little ivory. I was therefore very glad when some natives brought me news that a large herd of elephants were feeding in a valley about 30 miles away. At first I thought of trekking down to the valley, wagon and all, but gave up the idea on hearing that it was infested with the deadly Stet's fly, which is certain death to all animals, except men, donkeys, and wild game. So I reluctantly determined to leave the wagon in the charge of the Matabele leader and driver, and to start on a trip into the Thorn country, accompanied only by the Hottentot hands and machine. Accordingly, on the following morning we started, and on the evening of the next day reached the spot where the elephants were reported to be. But here again we were met by ill luck. That the elephants had been there was evident enough, for their spoor was plentiful, and so were other traces of their presence in the shape of mimosa trees, torn out of the ground and placed topsy-turvy on their flat crowns, in order to enable the great beasts to feed on their sweet roots. But the elephants themselves were conspicuous by their absence. They had elected to move on. This being so, there was only one thing to do, and that was to move after them, which we did, and a pretty hunt they led us. For a fortnight or more we dodged about after those elephants, coming up with them on 2 occasions, and a splendid herd they were, only, however, to lose them again. At length we came up with them a 3rd time, and I managed to shoot one bull, and then they started off again, where it was useless to try and follow them. After this I gave it up in disgust, and we made the best of our way back to the camp, not in the sweetest of tempers, carrying the tusks of the elephant I had shot. It was on the afternoon of the 5th day of our tramp that we reached the little koppie overlooking the spot where the wagon stood, and I confess that I climbed it with a pleasurable sense of homecoming, for his wagon is the hunter's home, as much as his house is that of the civilized person. I reached the top of the koppie, and looked in the direction where the friendly white tent of the wagon should be. But there was no wagon, only a black burnt plain stretching away as far as the eye could reach. I rubbed my eyes, looked again, and made out on the spot of the camp, not my wagon, but some charred beams of wood. Half wild with grief and anxiety, followed by Hans and Mashoon, I ran at full speed down the slope of the koppie, and across the space of plain below to the spring of water, where my camp had been. I was soon there, only to find that my worst suspicions were confirmed. The wagon and all its contents, including my spare guns and ammunition, had been destroyed by a grass fire. Now, before I started, I had left orders with the driver to burn off the grass round the camp, in order to guard against accidents of this nature, and here was the reward of my folly. A very proper illustration of the necessity, especially where natives are concerned, of doing a thing oneself if one wants it done at all. Evidently the lazy rascals had not burnt round the wagon. Most probably, indeed, they had themselves carelessly fired the tall and resinous tambuki grass nearby. The wind had driven the flames on to the wagon tent, and there was quickly an end of the matter. As for the driver and leader, I know not what became of them. Probably fearing my anger, they bolted, taking the oxen with them. I have never seen them from that hour to this. I sat down on the black veldt by the spring, and gazed at the charred axles and dissel boom of my wagon, and I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, I felt inclined to weep. As for Mashune and Hans, they cursed away vigorously, one in Zulu and the other in Dutch. Ours was a pretty position. We were nearly 300 miles away from Bamangwato, the capital of Khama's country, which was the nearest spot where we could get any help, and our ammunition, spare guns, clothing, food, and everything else were all totally destroyed. I had just what I stood in, which was a flannel shirt, a pair of veldschoons or shoes of rawhide, my 8-bore rifle, and a few cartridges. Hans and Mashune had also each a martini rifle and some cartridges. Not many. And it was with this equipment that we had to undertake a journey of 300 miles through a desolate and almost uninhabited region. I can assure you that I have rarely been in a worse position, and I have been in some queer ones. However, these things are the natural incidents of a hunter's life, and the only thing to do was to make the best of them. Accordingly, after passing a comfortless night by the remains of my wagon, we started next morning on our long journey towards civilization. Now, if I were to set to work to tell you all the troubles and incidents of that dreadful journey, I should keep you listening here till midnight. So I will, with your permission, pass on to the particular adventure of which the pair of buffalo horns opposite are the melancholy memento. We had been travelling for about a month, living and getting along as best we could, when one evening we camped some 40 miles from Bamangwato. By this time we were indeed in a melancholy plight, footsore, half-starved, and utterly worn out, and, in addition, I was suffering from a sharp attack of fever, which half-blinded me and made me weak as a babe. Our ammunition, too, was exhausted. I had only one cartridge left for my 8-bore rifle, and Hans and Mashune, who were armed with Martini Henrys, had 3 between them. It was about an hour from sundown when we halted and lit a fire, for luckily we had still a few matches. It was a charming spot to camp, I remember. Just off the game track we were following was a little hollow, fringed about with flat-crowned mimosa trees, and at the bottom of the hollow a spring of clear water welled up out of the earth and formed a pool, round the edges of which grew an abundance of watercresses of an exactly similar kind to those which were handed round the table just now. Now we had no food of any kind left, having that morning devoured the last remains of a little Oreban antelope, which I had shot 2 days previously. Accordingly Hans, who was a better shot than Mashune, took 2 of the 3 remaining Martini cartridges, and started out to see if he could not kill a buck for supper. I was too weak to go myself. Meanwhile, Mashun employed himself in dragging together some dead boughs from the moser trees to make a sort of skirm or shelter for us to sleep in, about 40 yards from the edge of the pool of water. We had been greatly troubled with lions in the course of our long tramp, and only on the previous night have very nearly been attacked by them, which made me nervous, especially in my weak state. Just as we had finished the skirm, or rather something which did duty for one, Mashun and I heard a shot apparently fired about a mile away. Hark to it. I sung out Mashun in Zulu, more, I fancy, by way of keeping his spirits up than for any other reason, for he was a sort of black Mark Tapley, and very cheerful under difficulties. Hark to the wonderful sound with which the Mabuna, the Boers, shook our fathers to the ground at the Battle of the Blood River. We are hungry now, my father. Our stomachs are small, and withered up like a dried ox's paunch, but they will soon be full of good meat. Hans is a Hottentot and an Umfergozen, that is, a low fellow, but he shoots straight. Ah, he certainly shoots straight. Be of a good heart, my father, there will soon be meat upon the fire, and we shall rise up men. And so he went on talking nonsense till I told him to stop, because he made my head ache with his empty words. Shortly after we heard the shot the sun sank in his red splendour, and there fell upon earth and sky the great hush of the African wilderness. The lions were not up as yet. They would probably wait for the moon, and the birds and beasts were all at rest. I cannot describe the intensity of the quiet of the night. To me in my weak state, and fretting as I was over the return of the Hottentot Hans, it seemed almost ominous, as though nature were brooding over some tragedy which was being enacted in her sight. It was quiet as death, and lonely as the grave. Mashun, I said at last, where is Hans? My heart is heavy for him. Nay, my father, I know not. Mayhap he is weary, and sleeps, or mayhap he has lost his way. Mashun, art thou a boy to talk folly to me? I answered. Tell me, in all the years that hast hunted by my side, didst thou ever know a Hottentot to lose his path, or to sleep upon the way to camp? Nay, Macumazahn, that, ladies, is my native name, and means the man who gets up by night, or who is always awake. I know not where he is. But though we talked thus, we neither of us liked to hint at what was in both our minds, namely, that misfortunate had overtaken the poor Hottentot. Mashun, I said at last, go down to the water and bring me of those green herbs that grow there. I am hungered, and must eat something. Nay, my father, surely the ghosts are there. They come out of the water at night, and sit upon the banks to dry themselves. An Isanusi, a witch-finder, told it me. Mashun was, I think, one of the bravest men I ever knew in the daytime, but he had a more than civilized dread of the supernatural. Must I go myself? Thou fool, I said sternly. Nay, Macumazahn, if thy heart yearns for strange things like a sick woman, I go, even if the ghosts devour me. And accordingly he went, and soon returned with a large bundle of watercresses, of which I ate greedily. Art thou not hungry? I asked the great Zulu presently, as he sat eyeing me eating. Never was I hungrier, my father. Then eat, and I pointed to the watercresses. Nay, Macumazahn, I cannot eat those herbs. If thou dost not eat, thou wilt starve. Eat, Mashun. He stared at the watercresses doubtfully for a while, and at last seized a handful and crammed them into his mouth, crying out as he did so, "Oh, why was I born that I should live to feed on green weeds like an ox? Surely if my mother could have known it, she would have killed me. When I was born." And so he went on lamenting between each fistful of watercresses, till all were finished, when he declared that he was full indeed of stuff, but it lay very cold on his stomach, like snow upon a mountain. At any other time I should have laughed, for it must be admitted he had a ludicrous way of putting things. Zulus do not like green food. Just after Mashun had finished his watercress, we heard the loud woof, woof of a lion who was evidently promenading much nearer to our little skirm than was pleasant. Indeed, on looking into the darkness and listening intently, I could hear his snoring breath and catch the light of his great yellow eyes. We shouted loudly, and Mashun threw some sticks on the fire to frighten him, which apparently had the desired effect, for we saw no more of him for a while. Just after we had this fright from the lion, the moon rose in her fullest splendour, throwing a robe of silver light over all the earth. I have rarely seen a more beautiful moonrise. I remember that sitting in the skirm I could with ease read faint pencil notes in my pocket-book. As soon as the moon was up, game began to trek down to the water just below us. I could, from where I sat, see all sorts of them passing along a little ridge that ran to our right, on their way to the drinking place. Indeed, one buck, a large eland, came within 20 yards of the skirm and stood at gaze, staring at it suspiciously, his beautiful head and twisted horns standing out clearly against the sky. I recollect, every mind to have a pull at him on the chance of providing ourselves with a good supply of beef, but remembering that we had but 2 cartridges left, and the extreme uncertainty of a shot by moonlight, I at length decided to refrain. The eland presently moved on to the water, and a minute or 2 afterwards there arose a great sound of splashing, followed by the quick fall of galloping hoofs. "What's that, Mashun?" I asked. "That damn lion. Buck smell him," replied the Zulu in English, of which he had a very superficial knowledge. Scarcely were the words out of his mouth before we heard a sort of whine over the other side of the pool, which was instantly answered by a loud coughing roar close to us. "By Jove," I said, "there are 2 of them. They have lost the buck. We must look out they don't catch us." And again we made up the fire and shouted, with the result that the lions moved off. "Mashun," I said, "do you watch till the moon gets over that tree, when it will be the middle of the night. Then wake me. Watch well, now, or the lions will be picking those Worth's bones of yours before you are 3 hours older. I must rest a little, or I shall die." "Koos, chief," answered the Zulu. "Sleep, my father, sleep in peace. My eyes shall be open as the stars, and like the stars watch over you." Although I was so weak, I could not at once follow his advice. To begin with, my head ached with fever, and I was torn with anxiety as to the fate of the Hottentot hands, and, indeed, as to our own fate, left with sore feet, empty stomachs, and 2 cartridges, to find our way to Bamangwato, 40 miles off. Then the mere sensation of knowing that there are 1 or more hungry lions prowling round you somewhere in the dark is disquieting, however well one may be used to it, and, by keeping the attention on the stretch, tends to prevent one from sleeping. In addition to all these troubles, too. I remember, seized with a dreadful longing for a pipe of tobacco, whereas, under the circumstances, I might as well have longed for the moon. At last, however, I fell into an uneasy sleep as full of bad dreams as a prickly pear is of points, one of which, I recollect, was that I was setting my naked foot upon a cobra, which rose upon its tail and hissed my name, Macumazahn, into my ear. Indeed, the cobra hissed with such persistency that at last I roused myself. Macumazahn, Nanzia. There! There! Whispered Mashoon's voice into my drowsy ears. Raising myself, I opened my eyes, and I saw Mashoon kneeling by my side and pointing towards the water. Following the line of his outstretched hand, my eyes fell upon a sight that made me jump. Old hunter as I was even in those days. About 20 paces from the little skerm was a large ant heap, and on the summit of the ant heap, her 4 feet rather close together, so as to find standing space, stood the massive form of a big lioness. Her head was towards the skerm, and in the bright moonlight I saw her lower it and lick her paws. Mashoon thrust the martini rifle into my hands, whispering that it was loaded. I lifted it and covered the lioness, but found that even in that light I could not make out the foresight of the martini, as it would be madness to fire without doing so, for the result would probably be that I should wound the lioness, if, indeed, I did not miss her altogether. I lowered the rifle, and, hastily tearing a fragment of paper from one of the leaves of my pocket-book, which I had been consulting just before I went to sleep, I proceeded to fix it onto the front sight. But all this took a little time, and before the paper was satisfactorily arranged, Mashoon again gripped me by the arm, and pointed to a dark heap under the shade of a small mimosa tree which grew not more than 10 paces from the skerm. "Well, what is it?" I whispered. "I can see nothing." "It is another lion," he answered. "Nonsense. Thy heart is dead with fear. Thou seest double." And I bent forward over the edge of the surrounding fence and stared at the heap. Even as I said the words, the dark mass rose and stalked out into the moonlight. It was a magnificent, black-maned lion, one of the largest I had ever seen. When he had gone 2 or 3 steps, he caught sight of me, halted, and stood there gazing straight towards us. He was so close that I could see the firelight reflected in his wicked, greenish eyes. "Shoot, shoot," said Mashoon. "The devil is coming." "He is going to spring." I raised the rifle and got the bit of paper on the foresight. A straight on to a little path of white hair, just where the throat is set into the chest and shoulders. As I did so, the lion glanced back over his shoulder, as, according to my experience, a lion nearly always does before he springs. Then he dropped his body a little, and I saw his big paws spread out upon the ground as he put his weight on them to gather purchase. In haste, I pressed the trigger of the martini, and not a moment too soon, for as I did so, he was in the act of springing. The report of the rifle rang out sharp and clear on the intense silence of the night, and in another second the great brute had landed on his head within 4 feet of us, and rolling over and over towards us, was sending the bushes which composed our little fence flying with convulsive strokes of his great paws. We sprang out of the other side of the skerm, and he rolled onto it and into it, and then right through the fire. Next he raised himself and sat upon his haunches like a great dog, and began to roar. Heavens! How he roared! I never heard anything like it before or since. He kept filling his lungs with air, and then emitting it in the most heart-shaking volumes of sound. Suddenly, in the middle of one of the loudest roars, he rolled over onto his side and lay still, and I knew that he was dead. A lion generally dies upon his side. With a sigh of relief, I looked up towards his mate upon the ant heap. She was standing there apparently petrified with astonishment, looking over her shoulder and lashing her tail, but to our intense joy, when the dying beast ceased roaring, she turned, and, with one enormous bound, vanished into the night. Then we advanced cautiously towards the prostrate brute, Mashun droning an improvised Zulu song as he went, about how Macumazahn, the hunter of hunters, whose eyes are open by night as well as by day, put his hand down the lion's stomach when it came to devour him and pulled out his heart by the roots, etc., etc., by way of expressing his satisfaction, in his hyperbolical Zulu way, at the turn events had taken. There was no need for caution. The lion was as dead as though he had already been stuffed with straw. The martini bullet had entered within an inch of the white spot I had aimed at, and travelled right through him, passing out at the right buttock, near the root of the tail. The martini has wonderful driving power, though the shock it gives to the system is, comparatively speaking, slight, owing to the smallness of the hole it makes. But fortunately the lion is an easy beast to kill. I passed the rest of that night in a profound slumber, my head reposing upon the deceased lion's flank, a position that had, I thought, a beautiful touch of irony about it, though the smell of his singed hair was disagreeable. When I woke again, the faint primrose lights of dawn were flushing in the eastern sky. For a moment I could not understand the chill sense of anxiety that lay like a lump of ice at my heart, till the feel and smell of the skin of the dead lion beneath, my head recalled the circumstances in which we were placed. I rose and eagerly looked round to see if I could discover any signs of Hans, who, if he had escaped accident, would surely return to us at dawn. But there were none. Then hope grew faint, and I felt that it was not well with the poor fellow. Setting Mashun to build up the fire, I hastily removed the hide from the flank of the lion, which was indeed a splendid beast, and cutting off some lumps of flesh, we toasted and ate them greedily. Lion's flesh, strange as it may seem, is very good eating, and tastes more like veal than anything else. By the time we had finished our much-needed meal, the sun was getting up, and after a drink of water and a wash at the pool, we started to try and find Hans, leaving the dead lion to the tender mercies of the Hin-Nars. Both Mashun and myself were, by constant practice, pretty good hands at tracking, and we had not much difficulty in following the Hottentot's spoor, faint as it was. We had gone on in this way for half an hour or so, and were, perhaps, a mile or more from the site of our camping place, when we discovered the spoor of a solitary bull, a buffalo mixed up with the spoor of Hans, and were able, from various indications, to make out that he had been tracking the buffalo. At length we reached a little glade in which there grew a stunted old mimosa thorn, with a peculiar and overhanging formation of root, under which a porcupine, or an ant bear, or some such animal, had hollowed out a wide-lipped hole. About 10 or 15 paces from this thorn tree there was a thick patch of bush. "See, Macumazahn! See!" said Mashun excitedly, as we drew near the thorn. The buffalo has charged him. Look, here he stood to fire at him. See how firmly he planted his feet upon the earth. There is the mark of his crook too. Hans had one bent too. Look! Here the bull came like a boulder down the hill, his hoofs turning up the earth like a hoe. Hans had hit him. He bulled as he came. There are the blood spots. It is all written down there, my father, there upon the earth. Yes, I said. Yes, but where is Hans? Even as I said it, Mashun clutched my arm and pointed to the stunted thorn just by us. Even now, gentlemen, it makes me feel sick when I think of what I saw. For fixed in a stout fork of the tree, some 8 feet from the ground, was Hans himself, or rather his dead body, evidently tossed there by the furious buffalo. One leg was twisted round the fork, probably in a dying convulsion. In the side, just beneath the ribs, was a great hole from which the entrails protruded. But this was not all. The other leg hung down to within 5 feet of the ground. The skin and most of the flesh were gone from it. For a moment we stood agape, and gazed at this horrifying sight. Then I understood what had happened. The buffalo, with that devilish cruelty which distinguishes the animal, had, after his enemy was dead, stood underneath his body and licked the flesh off the pendant leg with his file, like tongue. I had heard of such a thing before, but had always treated the stories as hunters' yarns. But I had no doubt about it now. Poor Hans' skeleton foot and ankle were an ample proof. We stood aghast under the tree, and stared at this awful sight, when suddenly our cogitations were interrupted in a painful manner. The thick bush about 15 paces off burst asunder with a crashing sound, and uttering a series of ferocious grunts, the bull buffalo himself came charging out straight at us. Even as he came, I saw the mark on his side, where poor Hans' bullet had struck him, and also, as is often the case with particularly savage buffaloes, that his flanks had recently been terribly torn in an encounter with a lion. On he came, his head well up. A buffalo does not generally lower his head till he does so to strike. Those great black horns, as I look at them before me, gentlemen, I seem to see them come charging at me as I did 10 years ago, silhouetted against the green bush behind. On, on. With a shout, Mashun bolted off sideways towards the bush. I had instinctively lifted my 8-bore, which I had in my hand. It would have been useless to fire at the buffalo's head, for the dense horns must have turned the bullet, but as Mashun bolted, the bull slewed a little, with the momentary idea of following him, and as this gave me a ghost of a chance, I let drive my only cartridge at his shoulder. The bullet struck the shoulder blade and smashed it up, and then travelled on under the skin into his flank, but it did not stop him, though for a second he staggered. Throwing myself onto the ground with the energy of despair, I rolled under the shelter of the projecting root of the thorn, crushing myself as far into the mouth of the ant-bear hole as I could. In a single instant the buffalo was after me, kneeling down on his uninjured knee, for one leg, that of which I had broken the shoulder, was swinging helplessly to and fro. He set to work to try and hook me out of the hole with his crooked horn. At first he struck at me furiously, and it was one of the blows the base of the tree which splintered the tip of the horn in the way that you see. Then he grew more cunning, and pushed his head as far under the root as possible. made long semicircular sweeps at me, grunting furiously, and blowing saliva and hot steamy breath all over me. I was just out of reach of the horn, though every stroke, by widening the hole and making more room for his head, brought it closer to me. But every now and again I received heavy blows in the ribs from his muzzle, feeling that I was being knocked silly. I made an effort in seizing his rough tongue, which was hanging from his jaws. I twisted it with all my force. The great brute bellowed with pain and fury, and jerked himself backwards so strongly that he dragged me some inches further from the mouth of the hole, and again made a sweep at me, catching me this time round the shoulder joint in the hook of his horn. I felt that it was all up now, and began to holloa. "He has got me," I shouted in mortal terror. "Gwassa, Mashoon, gwassa! Stab, Mashoon, stab!" One host of the great head. And out of the hole I came like a periwinkle out of his shell. But even as I did so, I caught sight of Mashoon's stalwart form advancing with his bangwan, or broad stabbing assegai, raised above his head. In another quarter of a second I had fallen from the horn, and heard the blow of the spear, followed by the indescribable sound of steel shearing its way through flesh. I had fallen on my back, and, looking up, I saw that the gallant Mashoon had driven the assegai a foot or more into the carcass of the buffalo, and was turning to fly. Alas! It was too late. Bellowing madly, and spouting blood from mouth and nostrils, the devilish brute was on him, and had thrown him up like a feather, and then gored him twice as he lay. I struggled up with some wild idea of affording help, but before I had gone a step the buffalo gave one long sighing below, and rolled over dead by the side of his victim. Mashoon was still living, but a single glance at him told me that his hour had come. The buffalo's horn had driven a great hole in his right lung, and inflicted other injuries. I knelt down beside him in the uttermost distress, and took his hand. "Is he dead, Macumazahn?" he whispered. "My eyes are blind, I cannot see." "Yes, he is dead." "Did the black devil hurt thee, Macumazahn?" "No, my poor fellow, I am not much hurt." "Ow! I am glad." Then came a long silence, broken only by the sound of the air whistling through the hole in his lung as he breathed. "Macumazahn, art thou there?" "I cannot feel thee." "I am here. Imashoon. I die, Macumazahn, the world flies round and round. I go out into the dark. Surely, my father, at times in days to come. Etho wilt think of Mashoon, who stood by thy side, when thou killest elephants, as we used. They were his last words. His brave spirit passed with him. I dragged his body to the hole under the tree, and pushed it in, placing his broad assegai by him, according to the custom of his people, that he might not go defenceless on his long journey. And then, ladies, I am not ashamed to confess, I stood alone there before it and wept like a woman. This concludes the story. We now turn to the next tale. Magepa the Buck. In a preface to a story of the early life of the late Alan Quatermain, known in Africa as Macumazahn, which has been published under the name of Mary, Mr. Curtis, the brother of Sir Henry Curtis, tells of how he found a number of manuscripts that were left by Mr. Quatermain in his house in Yorkshire. Of these, Mary was one, but in addition to it, and sundry other completed records the editor to whom it was directed that these manuscripts should be handed for publication, have found a quantity of unclassified notes and papers. Some of these deal with matters that have to do with sport and game, or with historical events, and some are memoranda of incidents connected with the career of the writer, or with remarkable occurrences that he had witnessed of which he does not speak elsewhere. One of these notes. It is contained in a book much soiled and worn that evidently its owner had carried about with him for years. Reminds me of a conversation that I had with Mr. Quatermain long ago when I was his guest in Yorkshire. The note itself is short. I think that he must have jotted it down within an hour or two of the event to which it refers. It runs thus. I wonder whether in the land beyond any recognition is granted for acts of great courage and unselfish devotion a kind of spiritual Victoria Cross. If so, I think it ought to be accorded to that poor old savage, Magepa, as it would be if I had any voice in the matter. Upon my word, he has made me feel proud of humanity, and yet he was nothing but a nigger, as so many call the Kaffirs. For a while I, the editor, wondered to what this entry could allude. Then of a sudden it all came back to me. I saw myself, as a young man, seated in the hall of Quatermain's house one evening after dinner. With me were Sir Henry Curtis and Captain Good. We were smoking, and the conversation had turned upon deeds of heroism. Each of us detailed such acts as he could remember which had made the most impression on him. When we had finished, old Allen said, "With your leave, I'll tell you a story of what I think was one of the bravest things I ever saw. It happened at the beginning of the Zulu War, when the troops were marching into Zululand. Now at that time, as you know, I was turning an honest penny transport, riding for the government, or rather for the military authorities. I hired them 3 wagons with the necessary voorloopers and drivers, 16 good salted oxen to each wagon, and myself in charge of the lot. They paid me, well, never mind how much. I am rather ashamed to mention the amount. The truth is that the imperial officers bought in a dear market during that Zulu War. Moreover, things were not always straight. I could tell you stories of folk, not all of them colonials, who got rich quicker than they ought, commissions and that kind of thing. But perhaps these are better forgotten. As for me, I asked a good price for my wagons, or rather for the hire of them, of a very well satisfied young gentleman in uniform who had been exactly 3 weeks in the country, and to my surprise, got it. But when I went to those in command and warned them what would happen if they persisted in their way of advance, then in their pride they would not listen to the old hunter and transport rider, but politely bowed me out. If they had, there would have been no Isandlwana disaster. He brooded a while, for, as I knew, this was a sore subject with him, one on which he would rarely talk. Although he escaped himself, Quatermain had lost friends on that fatal field. He went on. To return to old Magepa. I had known him for many years. The first time we met was in the Battle of the Tugela. I was fighting for the king's son, Umbalazi the Handsome, in the ranks of the Tulwana regiment. I mean to write all that story, for it should not be lost. Well, as I have told you before, the Tulwana were wiped out. Of the 3,000 or so of them, I think only about 50 remained alive after they had annihilated the 3 of Setweo's regiments that set upon them. But as it chanced, Magepa was one who survived. I met him afterwards at old King Panda's kraal and recognised him as having fought by my side. Whilst I was talking to him, the Prince Seatwayo came by. To me he was civil enough, for he knew how I chanced to be in the battle, but he glared at Magepa and said, "Why, Macumazahn, is not this man one of the dogs with which you tried to bite me by the Tugela not long ago? He must be a cunning dog also, one who can run fast, for how comes it that he lives to snore when so many will never bark again?" "Ow! If I had my way I would find a strip of hide to fit his neck." "Not so," I answered. "He has the king's peace, and he is a brave man, braver than I am. Anyway, Prince, seeing that I ran from the ranks of the Tulwana while he stood where he was." "You mean that your horse ran, Macumazahn? Well, since you like this dog, I will not hurt him," and with a shrug he went his way. "Yet soon or late he will hurt me," said Magepa, when the prince had gone. "Usetwayo has a memory long as the shadow thrown by a treat sunset. Moreover, as he knows well, it is true that I ran, Macumazahn, although not till all was finished, and I could do no more by standing still. You remember how, after we had eaten up the first of Setwayo's regiments, the second charged us, and we ate that up also? Well, in that fight I got a tap on the head from a kerry. It struck me on my man's ring, which I had just put on, for I think I was the youngest soldier in that regiment of veterans. The ring saved me, still, for a while I lost my mind and lay like one dead. When I found it again, the fight was over, and Setwayo's people were searching for our wounded that they might kill them. Presently they found me and saw that there was no hurt on me. 'Here is one who shams dead like a stink cat,' said a big fellow, lifting his spear. Then it was that I sprang up and ran, who was but just married and desired to live. He struck at me, but I jumped over the spear, and the others that they threw missed me. Then they began to hunt me, but, Macumazahn, I who am named the Buck, because I am swifter of foot than any man in Zululand, outpaced them all and got away safe. 'Well done, Magepa,' I said. 'Still, remember the saying of your people, at last the strong swimmer goes with the stream, and the swift runner is run down.' 'I know it, Macumazahn,' he answered, with a nod, 'and perhaps in a day to come I shall know it better.' I took little heed of his words at the time, but more than 30 years afterwards I remembered them. Such was my first acquaintance with Magepa. Now, friends, I will tell you how it was renewed at the time of the Zulu War. As you know, I was attached to the centre column that advanced into the Zululand by Rorke's Drift on the Buffalo River, before war was declared, or at any rate before the advance began, while it might have been, and many thought it would be averted. I was employed transport, riding goods to the little Rorke's Drift station, that which became so famous afterwards, and incidentally in collecting what information I could of Setwayo's intentions. Hearing that there was a kraal a mile, or so the other side of the river, of which the people were said to be very friendly to the English, I determined to visit it. You may think this was rash, but I was so well known in Zululand, where for many years, by special leave of the king, I was allowed to go whether I would quite unmolested, and, indeed, under the royal protection, that felt no faux fear for myself so long as I went alone. Accordingly one evening I crossed the drift and headed for a kloof, in which I was told the kraals stood. 10 minutes' ride brought me in sight of it. It was not a large kraal. There may have been 6 or 8 huts, and a cattle enclosure surrounded by the usual fence. The situation, however, was very pretty, a knoll of rising ground backed by the wooded slopes of the kloof. As I approached, I saw women and children running to the kraal to hide, and when I reached the gateway, for some time, no one would come out to meet me. At length a small boy appeared who informed me that the kraal was empty as a gourd. Quite so, I answered, still. Go and tell the headman that Macumazahn wishes to speak with him. The boy departed, and presently I saw a face that seemed familiar to me peeping round the edge of the gateway. After a careful inspection, its owner emerged. He was a tall, then man of indefinite age, perhaps between 60 and 70, with a finely cut face, a little grey beard, kind eyes, and very well-shaped hands and feet, the fingers which twitched incessantly being remarkably long. Greeting Macumazahn, he said, "I see you do not remember me. Well, think of the battle of the Tugela, and of the last stand of the Tolwana, and of a certain talk at the kraal of our father, who is dead. That is King Panda. And of how he who sits in his place, he meant Setwoyo, told you that if he had his way, he would find a hide rope to fit the neck of a certain one." "Ah!" I said, "I know you now. You are Magepa the Buck. So the runner has not yet been run down." "No, Macumazahn, not yet, but there is still time. I think that many swift feet will be at work ere long." "How have you prospered?" I asked him. "Well enough, Macumazahn, in all ways except one. I have 3 wives, but my children have been few and are dead, except one daughter, who is married and lives with me. For her husband, too, is dead. He was killed by a buffalo, and she has not yet married again. But enter and see." So I went in and saw Magepa's wives, old women all of them. Also, at his bidding, his daughter, whose name was Gita, brought me some Mars, or curdled milk, to drink. She was a well-formed woman, very like her father, but sad-faced, perhaps with a prescience of evil to come. Clinging to her finger was a beautiful boy of something under 2 years of age, who, when he saw Magepa, ran to him and threw his little arms about his legs. The old man lifted the child and kissed him tenderly, saying, "It is well that this toddler and I should love one another, Macumazahn, seeing that he is the last of my race. All the other children here are those of the people who have come to live in my shadow." "Where are their fathers?" I asked, patting the little boy who, his mother told me, was named Sinala upon the cheek an attention that he resented. "They have been called away on duty," answered Magepa shortly, and I changed the subject. Then we began to talk about old times, and I asked him if he had any oxen to sell, saying that this was my reason for visiting the kraal. "Nay, Macumazahn," he answered in a meaning voice. "This year all the cattle are the king's." I nodded and replied that, as it was so, I had better be going, wherein, as I half expected, Magepa announced that he would see me safe to the drift. So I bade farewell to the wives and the widowed daughter, and we started. As soon as we were clear of the kraal, Magepa began to open his heart to me. "Macumazahn," he said, looking up at me earnestly, for I was mounted, and he walked beside my horse, "there is to be war. Setwoyo will not consent to the demands of the great white chief from the Cape. He meant Sir Bartle Frere. He will fight with the English. Only he will let them begin the fighting. He will draw them on into Zululand, and then overwhelm them with his impis and stamp them flat, and eat them up, and I, who love the English, am very sorry. Yes, it makes my heart bleed. If it were the Boers now, I should be glad, for we Zulus hate the Boers. But the English we do not hate. Even Cetewayo likes them. Still, he will eat them up if they attack him. Indeed, I answered. And then as in duty bound I proceeded to get what I could out of him, and that was not a little. Of course, however, I did not swallow it all, since that I suspected that Magepa was feeding me with news that he had been ordered to disseminate. Presently we came to the mouth of the kloof, in which the kraal stood, and here, for greater convenience of conversation, we halted, for I thought it as well that we should not be seen in close talk on the open plain beyond. The path here, I should add, ran past a clump of green bushes. I remember they bore a white flower that smelt sweet, and were backed by some tall grass, elephant grass I think it was, among which grew mimosa trees. Magepa, I said, if in truth there is to be fighting, why don't you move over the river one night with your people and cattle, and get into Natal? I would if I could, Magepa, who have no stomach for this war against the English. But there I should not be safe, since presently the king will come in into Natal too, or send 30,000 assegais as his messengers. Then what will happen to those who have left him? Oh, if you think that, I answered, laughing, you had better stay where you are. Also, Magepa, the husbands of those women at my kraal have been called up to their regiments, and if their wives fled to the English, they would be killed. Again, the king has sent for nearly all our cattle to keep them safe. He fears lest we border Zulus might join our people in Natal, and that is why he is keeping our cattle safe. Life is more than cattle, Magepa. At least you might come. What, and leave my people to be killed? Magepa, you did not use to talk so. Still hearken. Magepa, will you do me a service? I will pay you well for it. I would get my daughter Gitta and my little grandson Sinala into safety. If I and my wives are wiped out, it does not matter, for we are old. But her I would save, and the boy I would save, so that one may live who will remember my name. Now, if I were to send them across the drift, say at the dawn, not tomorrow and not the next day, but the day after, would you receive them into your wagon and deliver them safe to some place in Natal? I have money hidden, 50 pieces of gold, and you may take half of these, and also half of the cattle, if ever I live to get them back out of the keeping of the king. Never mind about the money. And we will speak of the cattle afterwards, I said. I understand that you wish to send your daughter and your little grandson out of danger, and I think you wise, very wise. When once the advance begins, if there is an advance, who knows what may happen? War is a rough game, Magepa. It is not the custom of you black people to spare women and children, and there will be Zulus fighting on our side, as well as on yours. Do you understand? How? I understand, Magepa. I have known the face of war, and seen many a little one like my grandson Sinala assegaied upon his mother's back. Very good, but if I do this for you, you must do something for me. Say, Magepa, does Cetewayo really mean to fight, and if so, how? Oh yes. I know all you have been telling me, but I want not words but truth from the heart. You ask secrets, said the old fellow, peering about him into the gathering gloom. Still, a spear for a spear and shield for a shield, as our saying runs. I have spoken no lie. The king does mean to fight, not because he wants to, but because the regiments swear that they will wash their assegais. They who have never seen blood, since the battle of the Tugela in which we too played a part, and if he will not suffer it, well, there are more of his race. Also he means to fight thus, and he gave me some very useful information, that is, information which would have been useful if those in authority had deigned to pay any attention to it. When I passed it on, just as he had finished speaking, I thought that I heard a sound in the dense green bush behind us. It reminded me of the noise a man makes when he tries to stifle a cough, and frightened me. For if we had been overheard by a spy, Magepa was as good as dead, and the sooner I was across the river the better. "What's that?" I asked. "A bush buck, Macumazahn. There are lots of them about here." Not being satisfied, though it is true that buck do cough like this, I turned my horse to the bush, seeking an opening. Therian something crashed away and vanished into the long grass. In those shadows, of course, I could not see what it was, but such light as remained glinted on what might have been the polished tip of the horn of an antelope or an assegai. "I told you it was a buck." "Macumazahn," said Magepa. "Still, if you smell danger, let us come away from the bush, though the orders are that no white man is to be touched as yet." Then, while we walked on towards the ford, he set out with great detail, as Kaffirs do, the exact arrangements that he proposed to make for the handing over of his daughter and her child into my care. I remember that I asked him why he would not send her on the following morning, instead of 2 mornings later. He answered because he expected an outpost of scouts from one of the regiments at his kraal that night, who would probably remain there over the morrow and perhaps longer. While they were in the place, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for him to send away Gita and her son without exciting suspicion. Near the drift we parted, and I returned to our provisional camp and wrote a beautiful report of all that I had learned, of which report, I may add, no one took the slightest notice. I think it was the morning before that whereon I had arranged to meet Gita and the little boy at the drift, just about dawn, I went down to the river for a wash. Having taken my dip, I climbed onto a flat rock to dress myself, and looked at the billows of beautiful, pearly mist which hid the face of the water, and considered, I almost said, listened to the great silence, for as yet no live thing was stirring. Ah! If I had known of the hideous sights and sounds that were destined to be heard ere long in this same haunt of perfect peace. Indeed, at that moment there came a kind of hint or premonition of them, since suddenly, through the utter quiet, the blood, curdling wail of a woman. It was followed by other wails and shouts, distant and yet distinct. Then the silence fell again. Now, I thought to myself, that noise might very well have come from old Magepa's kraal. Luckily, however, sounds are deceptive in mist. Well, the end of it was that I waited there till the sun rose. The first thing on which its bright beams struck was a mighty column of smoke rising to heaven from where Magepa's kraal had stood. I went back to my wagons very sad, so sad that I could scarcely eat my breakfast. While I walked, I wondered hard whether the light had glinted upon the tip of a buck's horn in that patch of green bush with the sweet, smelling white flowers a night or 2 ago. Or had it perchance fallen upon the point of the assegai of some spy, who was watching my movements? In that event yonder column of smoke, and the horrible cries that preceded it were easy to explain. For had not Magepa and I talked secrets together, and in Zulu? On the following morning at dawn, I attended at the drift in the faint hope that Gita and her boy might arrive there, as arranged. But nobody came, which was not wonderful, seeing that Gita lay dead, stabbed through and through, as I saw afterwards. She made a good fight for the child, and that her spirit had gone to wherever go the souls of the brave-hearted, be they white or black. Only on the farther bank of the river I saw some Zulu scouts, who seemed to know my errand, for they called to me, asking mockingly where was the pretty woman I had come to meet. After that I tried to put the matter out of my head, which indeed was full enough of other things, since now definite orders had arrived as to the advance, and with these many troops and officers. It was just then that the Zulus began to fire across the river at such of our people as they saw upon the bank. At these they took aim, and, as a result, hit nobody. A raw Kaffir with a rifle, in my experience, is only dangerous when he aims at nothing. For then the bullet looks after itself and may catch you. To put a stop to this nuisance, a regiment of the friendly natives, there may have been several hundred of them, was directed to cross the river and clear the gloofs and rocks of the Zulu skirmishers who were hidden among them. I watched them go off in fine style, and in the course of the afternoon heard a good deal of shouting and banging of guns on the farther side of the river. Towards evening someone told me that our impi, as he called it grandiloquently, was returning victorious, having at the moment nothing else to do. I walked down to the river at a point where the water was deep and the banks were high. Here I climbed to the top of a pile of boulders, whence with my field glasses I could sweep a great extent of plain, which stretched away on the Zululand side, till at length it merged into hills and bush. Presently I saw some of our natives marching homewards in a scattered and disorganized fashion, but evidently very proud of themselves, for they were waving their assegais and singing scraps of war songs. A few minutes later, a mile or more away, I caught sight of a man running. Watching him through the glasses, I noted three things. First, that he was tall. Secondly, that he ran with extraordinary swiftness. And, thirdly, that he had something tied upon his back. It was evident, further, that he had good reason to run, since he was being hunted by a number of our Kaffirs, of whom more and more continually joined the chase. From every side they poured down upon him, trying to cut him off and kill him. For as they got nearer, I could see the assegais which they threw at him flash in the sunlight. Very soon I understood that the man was running with a definite object and to a definite point. He was trying to reach the river. I thought the sight very pitiful, this one poor creature being hunted to death by so many. Also I wondered why he did not free himself from the bundle on his back, and came to the conclusion that he must be a witch doctor, and that the bundle contained his precious charms or medicines. This was while he was yet a long way off, but when he came nearer, within 300 or 400 yards, of a sudden I caught the outline of his face against a good background, and knew it for that of Magepa. My God, I said to myself, it is old Magepa the Buck, and the bundle in the mat will be his grandson, Sinala. Yes. Even then I felt certain that he was carrying the child upon his back. What was I to do? It was impossible for me to cross the river at that place, and long before I could get round by the ford, all would be finished. I stood up on my rock and shouted to those brutes of Kaffirs to let the man alone. They were so excited that did not hear my words, at least. They swore afterwards that they thought I was encouraging them to hunt him down. But Magepa heard me. At the moment he seemed to be failing, but the sight of me appeared to give him fresh strength. He gathered himself together and leaped forward at a really surprising speed. Now the river was not more than 300 yards away from him. And, for the first 200 of these, he quite outdistanced his pursuers, although they were most of them young men and comparatively fresh. Then once more his strength began to fail. Watching through the glasses, I could see that his mouth was wide open and that there was red foam upon his lips. The burden on his back was dragging him down. Once he lifted his hands as though to loose it, then with a wild gesture let them fall again. Two of the pursuers who had outpaced the others crept up to him, lank, lean men of not more than 30 years of age. They had stabbing spears in their hands, such as are used at close quarters, and these, of course, they did not throw. One of them gained a little on the other. Now Magepa was not more than 50 yards from the bank, with the first hunter about 10 paces behind him and coming up rapidly. Magepa glanced over his shoulder and saw, then put out his last strength. For 40 yards he went like an arrow, running straight away from his pursuers, until he was within a few feet of the bank, when he stumbled and fell. "He's done," I said, and upon my word, if I had had a rifle in my hand, I think I would have stopped one or both of those bloodhounds and taken the consequences. But no. Just as the first man lifted his broad spear to stab him through the back on which the bundle lay, Magepa leaped up and wheeled round to take the thrust in the chest. Evidently he did not wish to be speared in the back, for a certain reason. He took it sure enough, for the assegai was wrenched out of the hand of the striker. Still, as he was reeling backwards, it did not go through Magepa. Or perhaps it hit a bone. He drew out the spear and threw it at the man, wounding him. Then he staggered on, back and back, to the edge of the little cliff. It was reached at last. With a cry of, "Help me, Macumazahn!" Magepa turned, and before the other man could spear him, leaped straight into the deep water. He rose. Yes, the brave old fellow rose and struck out for the other bank, leaving a little line of red behind him. I rushed, or rather sprang, and rolled down to the edge of the stream, to where a point of shingle ran out into the water. Along this I clambered, and beyond it up to my middle. Now Magepa was being swept past me. I caught his outstretched hand and pulled him ashore. "The boy!" he gasped. "The boy! Is he dead?" I severed the lashings of the mat that had cut right into the old fellow's shoulders. Inside of it was little Sinala, spluttering out water, but very evidently alive and unhurt, for presently he set up a yell. "No," I said, "he lives, and will live. Then all is well, Macumazahn." A pause. It was a spy in the bush, not a buck. He overheard our talk. The king's slayers came. Gita held the door of hut while I took the child, cut a hole through the straw with my assegai, and crept out at the back. She was full of spears before she died, but I got away with the boy. Till your Kaffirs found me, I lay hid in the bush, hoping to escape to Natal. Then I ran for the river, and saw you on the farther bank. I might have got away, but that child is heavy. A pause. Give him food, Macumazahn. He must be hungry. A pause. Farewell. That was a good saying of yours. The swift runner is outrun at last. Ah, yet I did not run in vain. Another pause, the last. Then he lifted himself upon one arm, and with the other saluted, first the boy Sinala and next me, muttering, "Remember your promise, Macumazahn." That is how Magepa the Buck died. I never saw anyone carrying weight who could run quite so well as he. And Quatermain turned his head away, as though the memory of this incident affected him somewhat. What became of the child Sinala? I asked presently. Oh, I sent him to an institution in Natal, and afterwards was able to get some of his property back for him. I believe that he is being trained as an interpreter. This concludes the story. We now turn to the next tale. Long odds. The story, which is narrated in the following pages, came to me from the lips of my old friend Alan Quatermain, or Hunter Quatermain, as we used to call him in South Africa. He told it to me one evening when I was stopping with him at the place he bought in Yorkshire. Shortly after that, the death of his only son so unsettled him that he immediately left England, accompanied by 2 companions, his old fellow voyagers, Sir Henry Curtis and Captain Good, and has now utterly vanished into the dark heart of Africa. He is persuaded that a white people, of which he has heard rumours all his life, exists somewhere on the highlands in the vast, still unexplored interior, and his great ambition is to find them before he dies. This is the wild quest upon which he and his companions have departed, and from which I shrewdly suspect they never will return. One letter only have I received from the old gentleman, dated from a mission station high up the Tana, a river on the east coast, about 300 miles north of Zanzibar. In it he says that they have gone through many hardships and adventures, but are alive and well, and have found traces which go far toward making him hope that the results of their wild quest may be a magnificent and unexampled discovery. I greatly fear, however, that all he has discovered is death, for this letter came a long while ago, and nobody has heard a single word of the party since. They have totally vanished. It was on the last evening of my stay at his house that he told the ensuing story to me and Captain Good, who was dining with him. He had eaten his dinner and drunk 2 or 3 glasses of old port, just to help Good and myself to the end of the second bottle. It was an unusual thing for him to do, for he was a most abstemious man, having conceived, as he used to say, a great horror of drink from observing its effects upon the class of colonists, hunters, transport riders and others, amongst whom he had passed so many years of his life. Consequently, the good wine took more effect on him than it would have done on most men, sending a little flush into his wrinkled cheeks, and making him talk more freely than usual. "Dear old man! I can see him now," as he went limping up and down the vestibule, with his grey hair sticking up in scrubbing brush fashion, his shrivelled yellow face, and his large dark eyes that were as keen as any hawk's, and yet soft as a buck's. The whole room was hung with trophies of his numerous hunting expeditions, and he had some story about every one of them. If only he could be got to tell it. Generally he would not, for he was not very fond of narrating his own adventures. But tonight the port wine made him more communicative. "Ah, you brute," he said, stopping beneath an unusually large skull of a lion, which was fixed just over the mantelpiece, beneath a long row of guns, its jaws distended to their utmost width.
"Ah, you brute!
You have given me a lot of trouble for the last dozen years, and will, I suppose, to my dying day. Tell us the yarn, Quatermain," said Good. "You have often promised to tell me, and you never have." "You had better not ask me to," he answered, "for it is a longish one." "All right," I said. "The evening is young, and there is some more port." Thus adjured. He filled his pipe from a jar of coarse, cut Boer tobacco that was always standing on the mantelpiece, and still walking up and down the room, began. It was, I think, in the March of '69 that I was up in Sikikuni's country. It was just after old Sequiti's time, and Sikikuni had got into power. I forget how. Anyway, I was there. I had heard that the Bapedi people had brought down an enormous quantity of ivory from the interior, and so I started with a wagon load of goods and came straight away from Middelburg to try and trade some of it. It was a risky thing to go into the country so early, on account of the fever, but I knew that there were one or two others after that lot of ivory, so I determined to have a try for it and take my chance of fever. I had become so tough from continual knocking about that I did not set it down at much. Well, I got on all right for a while. It is a wonderfully beautiful piece of bush veldt with great ranges of mountains running through it, and round granite koppies starting up here and there, looking out like sentinels over the rolling waste of bush. But it is very hot, hot as a stew pan. And when I was there that March, which of course is autumn in this part of Africa, the whole place reeked of fever. Every morning, as I trekked along down by the Oliphant River, I used to creep from the wagon at dawn and look out. But there was no river to be seen. Only a long line of billows of what looked like the finest cotton wool, tossed up lightly with a pitchfork. It was the fever mist. Out from among the scrub, too, came little spirals of vapour, as though there were hundreds of tiny fires alight in it. Reek rising from thousands of tons of rotting vegetation. It was a beautiful place, but the beauty was the beauty of death. And all those lines and blots of vapour root one great word across the surface of the country, and that word was fever. It was a dreadful year of illness that. I came, I remember, to one little kraal of knobnoses, and went up to it to see if I could get some maas, a curdled buttermilk, and a few mealies. As I got near, I was struck with the silence of the place. No children began to chatter, and no dogs barked. Nor could I see any native sheep or cattle. The place, though it had evidently been recently inhabited, was as still as the bush round it. And some guinea fowl got up out of the prickly pear, bushes right, at the kraal gate. I remember that I hesitated a little before going in. There was such an air of desolation about the spot. Nature never looks desolate when man has not yet laid his hand upon her breast. She is only lovely. But when man has been, and has passed away, then she looks desolate. Well, I passed into the kraal and went up to the principal hut. In front of the hut was something with an old sheepskin kaross, rug, thrown over it. I stooped down and drew off the rug, and then shrank back amazed. For under it was the body of a young woman recently dead. For a moment I thought of turning back, but my curiosity overcame me. So going past the dead woman, I went down on my hands and knees and crept into the hut. It was so dark that I could not see anything, although I could smell a great deal, so I lit a match. It was a tanstick or match and burnt slowly and dimly, and as the light gradually increased, I made out what I took to be a family of people. Men, women, and children fast asleep. Presently it burnt up brightly, and I saw that they too, 5 of them altogether, were quite dead. One was a baby. I dropped the match in a hurry, and was making my way out of the hut as hard as I could go, when I caught sight of 2 bright eyes staring out of a corner. Thinking it was a wild cat, or some such animal, I redoubled my haste, when suddenly a voice near the eyes began first to mutter, and then to send up a succession of awful yells. Hastily I lit another match, and perceived that the eyes belonged to an old woman, wrapped up in a greasy leather garment. Taking her by the arm, I dragged her out, for she could not, or would not, come by herself, and the stench was overpowering me. Such a sight as she was, a bag of bones, covered over with black, shriveled parchment. The only white thing about her was her wool, and she seemed to be pretty well dead except for her eyes and her voice. She thought that I was a devil come to take her, and that is why she yelled so. Well, I got her down to the wagon and gave her a tot of cape smoke, and then, as soon as it was ready, poured about a pint of beef tea down her throat, made from the flesh of a blue wilder beast I had killed the day before, and after that she brightened up wonderfully. She could talk Zulu, indeed. It turned out that she had run away from Zululand in Chaka's time, and she told me that all the people whom I had seen had died of fever. When they had died, the other inhabitants of the kraal had taken the cattle and gone away, leaving the poor old woman, who was helpless from age and infirmity, to perish of starvation or disease, as the case might be. She had been sitting there for 3 days among the bodies when I found her. I took her on to the next kraal, and gave the headman a blanket to look after her, promising him another if I found her well, when I came back. I remember that he was much astonished at my parting with 2 blankets for the sake of such a worthless old creature. Why did I not leave her in the bush? He asked. Those people carry the doctrine of the survival of the fittest to its extreme, you see. It was the night after I had got rid of the old woman that I made my first acquaintance with my friend Yonder. And he nodded toward the skull that seemed to be grinning down at us in the shadow of the wide Mantell shelf. I had trekked from dawn till 11 o'clock. A long trick, but I wanted to get on, and then had turned the oxen out to graze, sending the voorlooper to look after them, meaning to inspan again about 6 o'clock and trek with the moon till 10. Then I got into the wagon and had a good sleep till 2:30 or so in the afternoon, when I rose and cooked some meat, and had my dinner, washing it down with a pannikin of black coffee, for it was difficult to get preserved milk in those days. Just as I had finished, and the driver, a man called Tom, was washing up the things, in comes the young scoundrel of a voorlooper driving 1 ox before him. "Where are the other oxen?" I asked. "Coos," he said. "Chief, the other oxen have gone away." I turned my back for a minute, and when I looked round again they were all gone, except Captain, here, who was rubbing his back against a tree. "You mean that you have been asleep, and let them stray, you villain." "I will rub your back against a stick," I answered, feeling very angry, for it was not a pleasant prospect to be stuck up in that fever trap for a week or so while we were hunting for the oxen. Off you go, and you too, Tom, and mind you don't come back till you have found them. They have trekked back along the Middleburg Road, and are a dozen miles off by now, I'll be bound. Now, no words go, both of you. Tom, the driver, swore and caught the lad a hearty kick, which he richly deserved, and then, having tied old Captain up to the disselboom with a riem, they took their assegais and sticks and started. I would have gone too, only I knew that somebody must look after the wagon, and I did not like to leave either of the boys with it at night. I was in a very bad temper, indeed, although I was pretty well used to these sort of occurrences, and soothed myself by taking a rifle and going to kill something. For a couple of hours I poked about, without seeing anything that I could get a shot at. But at last, just as I was again within 70 yards of the wagon, I put up an old impala ram from behind a mimosa thorn. He ran straight for the wagon, and it was not till he was passing within a few feet of it that I could get a decent shot at him. Then I pulled, and caught him half-way down the spine. Over he went, dead as a door-nail, and a pretty shot it was, though I ought not to say it. This little incident put me into rather a better temper, especially as the buck had rolled right against the after part of the wagon, so I had only to gut him, fix a riem round his legs, and haul him up. By the time I had done this the sun was down, and the full moon was up, and a beautiful moon it was. And then there came the wonderful hush which sometimes falls over the African bush in the early hours of the night. No beast was moving, and no bird called. Not a breath of air stirred the quiet trees, and the shadows did not even quiver. They only grew. It was very oppressive and very lonely, for there was not a sign of the cattle or the boys. I was quite thankful for the society of old Captain, who was lying down contentedly against the disselboom, chewing the cud with a good conscience. Presently, however, Captain began to get restless. First he snorted, then he got up and snorted again. I couldn't make it out, so like a fool I got down off the wagon, boxed to have a look round, thinking it might be the lost oxen coming. Next instant I regretted it, for all of a sudden I heard a roar and saw something yellow flash past me and light on poor Captain. Then came a bellow of agony from the ox, and a crunch as the lion put his teeth through the poor brute's neck, and I began to understand what had happened. My rifle was in the wagon, and my first thought was to get hold of it, and I turned and made a bolt for it. I got my foot on the wheel and flung my body forward onto the wagon, and there I stopped as if I were frozen, and no wonder, for as I was about to spring up I heard the lion behind me, and next second I felt the brute, as plainly as I can feel this table. I felt him, I say, sniffing at my left leg that was hanging down. My word, I did feel queer. I don't think that I ever felt so queer before. I dared not move for the life of me, and the odd thing was that I seemed to lose power over my leg, which developed an insane sort of inclination to kick out of its own mere motion, just as hysterical people want to laugh when they ought to be particularly solemn. Well, the lion sniffed and sniffed, beginning at my ankle and slowly nosing away up to my thigh. I thought that he was going to get hold then, but he did not. He only growled softly, and went back to the ox. Shifting my head a little, I got a full view of him. He was about the biggest lion I ever saw, and I have seen a great many. And he had a most tremendous black mane. What his teeth were like you can see. Look there, pretty big ones, ain't they? Altogether, he was a magnificent animal, and as I lay sprawling on the fore-tongue of the wagon, it occurred to me that he would look uncommonly well in a cage. He stood there by the carcass of poor Captain, and deliberately disemboweled him as neatly as a butcher could have done. All this while I dared not move, for he kept lifting his head and keeping an eye on me as he licked his bloody chops. When he had cleaned Captain out, he opened his mouth and roared, and I am not exaggerating when I say that the sound shook the wagon. Instantly there came back an answering roar. Heavens! I thought, there is his mate. Hardly was the thought out of my head when I caught sight in the moonlight of the lioness, bounding along through the long grass, and after her a couple of cubs about the size of mastiffs. She stopped within a few feet of my head and stood and waved her tail and fixed me with her glowing yellow eyes. But just as I thought that it was all over, she turned and began to feed on Captain, and so did the cubs. There were the 4 of them within 8 feet of me, growling and quarrelling, rending and tearing, and crunching poor Captain's bones. And there I lay shaking with terror and the cold perspiration pouring out of me, feeling like another Daniel come to judgment in a new sense of the phrase. Presently the cubs had eaten their fill and began to get restless. One went round to the back of the wagon and pulled at the impala buck that hung there, and the other came round my way and commenced the sniffing game at my leg. Indeed, he did more than that, for, my trouser being hitched up a little, he began to lick the bare skin with his rough tongue. The more he licked, the more he liked it, to judge from his increased vigour and the loud purring noise he made. Then I knew that the end had come, for in another second his file, like tongue, would have rasped through the skin of my leg, which was luckily pretty tough, and have drawn the blood. And then there would be no chance for me. So I just lay there and thought of my sins, and prayed to the Almighty, and thought that, after all, life was a very enjoyable thing. And then all of a sudden I heard a crashing of bushes and the shouting and whistling of men. And there were the 2 boys coming back with the cattle, which they had found trekking along all together. The lions lifted their heads and listened, then without a sound bounded off, and I fainted. The lions came back no more that night, and by the next morning my nerves had got pretty straight again. But I was full of wrath when I thought of all that I had gone through at the hands, or rather noses, of those 4 lions, and of the fate of my after-ox, Captain. He was a splendid ox, and I was very fond of him. So wroth was I that, like a fool, I determined to attack the whole family of them. It was worthy of a greenhorn out on his first hunting trip, but I did it nevertheless. Accordingly, after breakfast, having rubbed some oil upon my leg, which was very sore from the cub's tongue, I took the driver, Tom, who did not half like the job, and having armed myself with an ordinary double no, 12 smoothbore, the first breech loader I ever had, I started. I took the smoothbore because it shot a bullet very well, and my experience has been that a round ball from a smoothbore is quite as effective against a lion as an express bullet. The lion is soft, and not a difficult animal to finish if you hit him anywhere in the body. A buck takes far more killing. Well, I started. And the first thing I set to work to do was to try to make out whereabouts the brutes lay up for the day. About 300 yards from the wagon was the crest of a rise covered with single mimosa trees, dotted about in a park-like fashion. And beyond this was a stretch of open plain running down to a dry pan, or water hole, which covered about an acre of ground, and was densely clothed with reeds, now in the sere and yellow leaf. From the farther edge of this pan the ground sloped up again to a great cleft, or nullah, which had been cut out by the action of the water, and was pretty thickly sprinkled with bush, among which grew some large trees. I forget of what sort. It at once struck me that the dry pan would be a likely place to find my friends in, as there is nothing a lion is fonder of than lying up in reeds, through which he can see things without being seen himself. Accordingly thither I went and prospected. Before I had got halfway round the pan, I found the remains of a blue wilde, beast that had evidently been killed within the last 3 or 4 days, and partially devoured by lions. And from other indications about I was soon assured that if the family were not in the pan that day, they spent a good deal of their spare time there. But if there, the question was how to get them out. For it was clearly impossible to think of going in after them, unless one was quite determined to commit suicide. Now there was a strong wind blowing from the direction of the wagon, across the ready pan toward the bush-clad kloof, or donga, and this first gave me the idea of firing the reeds, which, as I think I told you, were pretty dry. Accordingly Tom took some matches and began starting little fires to the left, and I did the same to the right. But the reeds were still green at the bottom, and we should never have got them well alight, had it not been for the wind, which grew stronger and stronger as the sun climbed higher and forced the fire into them. At last, after half an hour's trouble, the flames got a hold, and began to spread out like a fan, whereupon I went round to the farther side of the pan to wait for the lions, standing well out in the open, as we stood at the copse today where you shot the woodcock. It was a rather risky thing to do, but I used to be so sure of my shooting in those days that I did not so much mind the risk. Scarcely had I got round when I heard the reeds parting before the onward rush of some animal. "Now for it," said I. On it came. I could see that it was yellow and prepared for action, when instead of a lion out bounded a beautiful reetbok which had been lying in the shelter of the pan. It must, by the way, have been a reetbok of a peculiarly confiding nature to lay itself down with the lion, like the lamb of prophecy. But I suppose the reeds were thick, and that it kept a long way off. Well, I let the reetbok go, and it went like the wind, and kept my eyes fixed upon the reeds. The fire was burning like a furnace now, the flames crackling and roaring as they bit into the reeds, sending spouts of fire 20 feet and more into the air, and making the hot air dance above it in a way that was perfectly dazzling. But the reeds were still half green, and created an enormous quantity of smoke, which came rolling toward me like a curtain, lying very low on account of the wind. Presently, above the crackling of the fire, I heard a startled roar, then another and another. So the lions were at home. I was beginning to get excited now, for, as you fellows know, There is nothing in experience to warm up your nerves like a lion at close quarters, unless it is a wounded buffalo. And I got still more so when I made out through the smoke that the lions were all moving about on the extreme edge of the reeds. Occasionally they would pop their heads out, like rabbits from a burrow, and then, catching sight of me standing about 50 yards out, draw them back again. I knew that it must be getting pretty warm behind them, and that they could not keep the game up for long. And I was not mistaken, for suddenly all four of them broke cover together, the old black, maned lion leading by a few yards. I never saw a more splendid sight in all my hunting experience than those four lions bounding across the veldt, overshadowed by the dense pall of smoke and backed by the fiery furnace of the burning reeds. I reckoned that they would pass. On their road to the bushy loof, within about 25 yards of me. So, taking a long breath, I got my gun well on to the lion's shoulder, the black-maned one, so as to allow for an inch or two of motion and catch him through the heart. I was on, dead on, and my finger was just beginning to tighten on the trigger when suddenly I went blind. A bit of reed, ash had drifted into my right eye. I danced and rubbed and succeeded in clearing it more or less just in time to see the tail of the last lion vanishing round the bushes up the kloof. If ever a man was mad, I was that man. It was too bad, and such a shot in the open too. However, I was not going to be beaten, so I just turned and marched for the kloof. Tom, the driver, begged and implored me not to go, but though as a general rule I never pretend to be very brave, which I am not, I was determined that I would either kill those lions or they should kill me. So I told Tom that he need not come unless he liked, but I was going, and being a plucky fellow, a Swazi by birth, he shrugged his shoulders, muttered that I was mad or bewitched, and followed doggedly in my tracks. We soon got to the kloof, which was about 300 yards in length, and but sparsely wooded, and then the real fun began. There might be a lion behind every bush. There certainly were 4 lions somewhere. The delicate question was, where? I peeped and poked and looked in every possible direction, with my heart in my mouth, and was at last rewarded by catching a glimpse of something yellow moving behind a bush. At the same moment, from another bush opposite me out, burst one of the cubs and galloped back toward the burned-out pan. I whipped round and let drive a snap shot that tipped him head over heels, breaking his back within 2 inches of the root of the tail. And there he lay helpless but glaring. Tom afterward killed him with his assegai. I opened the breech of the gun and hurriedly pulled out the old case, which, to judge from what ensued, must, I suppose, have burst and left a portion of its fabric sticking to the barrel. At any rate, when I tried to get in the new case, it would only enter halfway, and, would you believe it? This was the moment that the lioness, attracted no doubt by the outcry of her cub, chose to put in an appearance. There she stood, 20 paces or so from me, lashing her tail and looking just as wicked as it is possible to conceive. Slowly I stepped backward, trying to push in the new case, and as I did so she moved on in little runs, dropping down after each run. The danger was imminent, and the case would not go in. At the moment I oddly enough thought of the cartridge maker, whose name I will not mention, and earnestly hoped that if the lion got me some condign punishment would overtake him. it would not go in, so I tried to pull it out. It would not come out either, and my gun was useless if I could not shut it to use the other barrel. I might as well have had no gun. Meanwhile, I was walking backward, keeping my eye on the lioness, who was creeping forward on her belly without a sound, but lashing her tail and keeping her eye on me, and in it I saw that she was coming in a few seconds more. I dashed my wrist and the palm of my hand against the brass rim of the cartridge till the blood poured from them. "Look, there are the scars of it to this day!" Here Quatermain held up his right hand to the light and showed us 4 or 5 white cicatrices just where the wrist is set into the hand. But it was not of the slightest use. He went on. The cartridge would not move. I only hope that no other man will ever be put in such an awful position. The lioness gathered herself together, and I gave myself up for lost, when suddenly Tom shouted out from somewhere in my rear, "You are walking on to the wounded cub, turn to the right." I had the sense, dazed as I was, to take the hint, and slewing round at right angles. But still keeping my eyes on the lioness, I continued my backward walk. To my intense relief, with a low growl she straightened herself, turned, and bounded off farther up the kloof. "Come on, Inkoos," said Tom. "Let's get back to the wagon." "All right, Tom," I answered. "I will when I have killed those 3 other lions." For by this time I was bent on shooting them, as I never remember being on anything before or since. "You can go if you like, or you can get up a tree." He considered the position a little, and then he very wisely got up a tree. I wish that I had done the same. Meanwhile I had found my knife, which had an extractor in it, and succeeded, after some difficulty, in hauling out the case, which had so nearly been the cause of my death, and removing the obstruction in the barrel. It was very little thicker than a postage stamp, certainly not thicker than a piece of writing paper. This done, I loaded the gun, bound a handkerchief round my wrist, and hand to staunch the flowing of the blood, and started on again. I had noticed that the lioness went into a thick green bush, or rather cluster of bushes, growing near the water. For there was a little stream running down the kloof, about 50 yards higher up, and for this I made. When I got there, however, I could see nothing, so I took up a big stone and threw it into the bushes. I believe that it hit the other cub, for out it came with a rush, giving me a broadside shot, of which I promptly availed myself, knocking it over dead. Out, too, came the lioness like a flash of light, but, quick as she went, I managed to put the other bullet into her ribs, so that she rolled right over 3 times like a shot rabbit. I instantly got 2 more cartridges into the gun, and as I did, so the lioness rose again, and came crawling toward me on her 4 paws, roaring and groaning, and with such an expression of diabolical fury on her countenance as I have not often seen. I shot her again through the chest, and she fell over on to her side quite dead. That was the first and last time that I ever killed a brace of lions right and left, and, what is more, I never heard of anybody else doing it. Naturally, I was considerably pleased with myself, and having again loaded up, I went on to look for the black, maned beauty who had killed Capteen. Slowly, and with the greatest care, I proceeded up the kloof, searching every bush and tuft of grass as I went. It was wonderfully exciting work, for I never was sure from one moment to another but that he would be on me. I took comfort, however, from the reflection that a lion rarely attacks a man. Rarely, I say, sometimes he does, as you will see, unless he is cornered or wounded. I must have been nearly an hour hunting after that lion. Once I thought I saw something move in a clump of tambuki grass, but I could not be sure, and when I trod out the grass I could not find him. At last I worked up to the head of the kloof, which made a cul-de-sac. It was formed of a wall of rock about 50 feet high. Down this rock trickled a little waterfall, and in front of it, some 70 feet from its face, was a great piled-up mass of boulders, in the crevices and on the top of which grew ferns, grasses, and stunted bushes. This mass was about 25 feet high. The sides of the kloof here were also very steep. Well, I came to the top of the nullah and looked all round. No signs of the lion. Evidently I had either overlooked him farther down, or he had escaped right away. It was very vexatious. But still 3 lions were not a bad bag for 1 gun before dinner, and I was fain to be content. Accordingly I departed back again, making my way round the isolated pillar of boulders, beginning to feel, as I did so, that I was pretty well done up with excitement and fatigue, and should be more so before I had skinned those 3 lions. When I had got, as nearly as I could judge, about 18 yards past the pillar or mass of boulders, I turned to have another look round. I have a pretty sharp eye, but I could see nothing at all. Then, on a sudden, I saw something sufficiently alarming. On the top of the mass of boulders, opposite to me, standing out clear against the rock beyond, was the huge black-maned lion. He had been crouching there, and now arose as though by magic. There he stood lashing his tail, just like a living reproduction of the animal on the gateway of Northumberland House that I have seen a picture of. But he did not stand long. Before I could fire, before I could do more than get the gun to my shoulder, he sprang straight up and out from the rock, and driven by the impetus of that one mighty bound, came hurtling through the air toward me. Heavens! How grand he looked, and how awful! High into the air he flew, describing a great arch. Just as he touched the highest point of his spring I fired. I did not dare to wait, for I saw that he would clear the whole space and land right upon me. Without a sight, almost without aim, I fired, as one would fire a snap shot at a snipe. The bullet told, for I distinctly heard its thud above the rushing sound caused by the passage of the lion through the air. Next second I was swept to the ground. Luckily I fell into a low, creeper-clad bush, which broke the shock, and the lion was on the top of me. And the next those great, white teeth of his had met in my thigh, I heard them grate against the bone. I yelled out in agony, for I did not feel in the least benumbed and happy like Dr. Livingstone, whom, by the way, I knew very well and gave myself up for dead. But suddenly, at that moment, the lion's grip on my thigh loosened, and he stood over me, swaying to and fro, his huge mouth, from which the blood was gushing, wide opened. Then he roared, and the sound shook the rocks. To and from he swung, and then the great head dropped on me, knocking all the breath from my body, and he was dead. My bullet had entered in the centre of his chest, and passed out on the right side of the spine, about halfway down the back. The pain of my wound kept me from fainting, and as soon as I got my breath, I managed to drag myself from under him. Thank heavens! His great teeth had not crushed my thigh bone, but I was losing a great deal of blood, and had it not been for the timely arrival of Tom, with whose aid I got the handkerchief from my wrist and tied it round my leg, twisting it tight with a stick, I think that I should have bled to death. Well, it was a just reward for my folly in trying to tackle a family of lions single-handed. The odds were too long. I have been lame ever since, and shall be to my dying day. In the month of March the wound always troubles me a great deal, and every 3 years it breaks out raw. I need scarcely add that I never traded the lot of ivory at Sikukuni's. Another man got it, a German, and made £500 out of it after paying expenses. I spent the next month on the broad of my back, and was a cripple for 6 months after that. And now I've told you the yarn, so I will have a drop of Hollands and go to bed. This concludes the story. We now turn to the next tale. A Tale of 3 Lions. Chapter 1. The Interest on 10 Shillings. Most of you will have heard that Alan Quatermain, who was one of the party that discovered King Solomon's mines some little time ago, and who afterwards came to live in England near his friend Sir Henry Curtis. He went back to the wilderness again, as these old hunters almost invariably do, on one pretext or another. They cannot endure civilization for very long. Its noise and racket and the omnipresence of broad, clothed humanity proving more trying to their nerves than the dangers of the desert. I think that they feel lonely here, for it is a fact that is too little understood, though it has often been stated, that there is no loneliness like the loneliness of crowds, especially to those who are unaccustomed to them. What is there in the world? Old Quatermain would say, so desolate as to stand in the streets of a great city and listen to the footsteps falling, multitudinous as the rain, and watch the white line of faces as they hurry past, you know not whence, you know not whither. They come and go. Their eyes meet yours with a cold stare. For a moment their features are written on your mind, and then they are gone forever. You will never see them again. They will never see you again. They come up out of the unknown, and presently they once more vanish into the unknown, taking their secrets with them. Yes, that is loneliness pure and undefiled, but to one who knows and loves it, the wilderness is not lonely, because the spirit of nature is ever there to keep the wanderer company. He finds companions in the winds. The sunny streams babble like nature's children at his feet. High above them, in the purple sunset, are domes and minarets and palaces, such as no mortal man has built, in and out of whose flaming doors the angels of the sun seem to move continually. And there, too, is the wild game, following its feeding grounds in great armies, with the springbuck thrown out before for skirmishers, then rank upon rank of long-faced blesbuck, marching and wheeling like infantry, and last the shining troops of quagga, and the fierce-eyed, shaggy wildebeest to take, as it were, the place of the Cossack host that hangs upon an army's flanks. Oh, no, he would say, the wilderness is not lonely, for, my boy, remember that the further you get from man, the nearer you grow to God. And though this is a saying that might well be disputed, it is one I am sure that anybody will easily understand who has watched the sun rise and set on the limitless deserted plains, and seen the thunder chariots of the clouds roll in majesty across the depths of unfathomable sky. Well, at any rate we went back again, and now for many months I have heard nothing at all of him. And to be frank, I greatly doubt if anybody will ever hear of him again. I fear that the wilderness, that has for so many years been a mother to him, will now also prove his grave, and the grave of those who accompanied him. For the quest upon which he and they have started is a wild one indeed. But while he was in England for those 3 years, or so between his return from the successful discovery of the wise king's buried treasures and the death of his only son, I saw a great deal of old Alan Quatermain. I had known him years before in Africa, and after he came home. Whenever I had nothing better to do, I used to run up to Yorkshire and stay with him. And in this way, I at one time and another heard many of the incidents of his past life, and most curious some of them were. No man can pass all those years following the rough existence of an elephant hunter without meeting with many strange adventures, and in one way and another old Quatermain has certainly seen his share. Well, the story that I am going to tell you in the following pages is one of the later of these adventures, though I forget the exact year in which it happened. At any rate, I know that it was the only trip upon which he took his son Harry, who is since dead, with him, and that Harry was then about 14. And now for the story, which I will repeat as nearly as I can, in the words in which Hunter Quatermain told it to me one night in the old oak, panelled vestibule of his house in Yorkshire. We were talking about gold mining. Gold mining!
He broke in,
Yes, I once went gold mining at Pilgrim's Rest in the Transvaal, and it was after that we had the business about Jim and the lions. Do you know Pilgrim's Rest? Well, it is, or was, one of the queerest little places you ever saw. The town itself was pitched in a stony valley, with mountains all about it, and in the middle of such scenery as one does not often get the chance of seeing. Many and many is the time that I have thrown down my pick and shovel in disgust, clambered out of my claim, and walked a couple of miles or so to the top of some hill. Then I would lie down in the grass and look out over the glorious stretch of country, the smiling valleys, the great mountains touched with gold, real gold of the sunset, and clothed in sweeping robes of bush, and stare into the depths of the perfect sky above. Yes, and thank heaven I had got away from the cursing, and the coarse jokes of the miners, and the voices of those Basutu Kaffirs as they toiled in the sun, the memory of which is with me yet. Well, for some months I dug away patiently at my claim, till the very sight of a pick or of a washing trough became hateful to me. 100 times a day I lamented my own folly in having invested £800, which was about all that I was worth at the time, in this gold mining. But like other better people before me, I had been bitten by the gold bug, and now was forced to take the consequences. I bought a claim out of which a man had made a fortune, £5,000 or £6,000 at least, as I thought, very cheap. That is, I gave him £500 down for it. It was all that I had made by a very rough year's elephant, hunting beyond the Zambesi. And I sighed deeply and prophetically when I saw my successful friend, who was a Yankee, sweep up the roll of Standard Bank notes with the lordly air of the man who has made his fortune and cram them into his breeches pockets. Well, I said to him, the happy vendor, it is a magnificent property, and I only hope that my luck will be as good as yours has been. He smiled. To my excited nerves it seemed that he smiled ominously as he answered me in a peculiar Yankee drawl. "I guess, stranger, as I ain't the one to make a man quarrel with his food, more especial when there ain't no more going of the rounds. And as for that their claim, well, she's been a good nigger to me, but between you and me, stranger, speaking man to man, now that there ain't any filthy lucre between us to obscure the features of the truth, I guess she's about worked out," I gasped. The fellow's effrontery took the breath out of me. Only 5 minutes before he had been swearing by all his gods. And they appeared to be numerous and mixed, that there were 6 fortunes left in the claim, and that he was only giving it up because he was downright wary of shoveling the gold out. "Don't look so vexed, stranger," went on my tormentor. "Perhaps there is some shine in the old girl yet. Anyway, you are a downright good fellow. You are, therefore you will, I guess, have a realer one opportunity of working on the feelings of fortune. Anyway, it will bring the muscle up upon your arm, for the stuff is uncommon stiff, and, what is more, you will in the course of a year earn a sight more than $2,000 in value of experience." Then he went just in time, for in another moment I should have gone for him, and I saw his face no more. Well, I set to work on the old claim with my boy Harry, and 6 Kaffirs to help me, which, seeing that I had put nearly all my worldly wealth into it, was the least that I could do. And we did work, early and late we went at it, but never a bit of gold did we see. No. Not even a nugget large enough to make a scarf pin out of. The American gentleman had secured it all, and left us the sweepings. For 3 months this went on, till at last I had paid away all, or very near all, that was left of her little capital in wages, and food for the Kaffirs and ourselves. When I tell you that burr meal was sometimes as high as £4 a bag, you will understand that it did not take long to run through our banking account. At last the crisis came. One Saturday night I had paid the men as usual, and bought a moid of mealie meal at 60 shillings for them, to fill themselves with. And then I went with my boy Harry, and sat on the edge of the great hole that we had dug in the hillside, and which we had in bitter mockery named El Dorado. There we sat in the moonlight, with our feet over the edge of the claim, and were melancholy enough for anything. Presently I pulled out my purse and emptied its contents into my hand. There was a half-sovereign, 2 florins, 9pence in silver. No coppers, for copper practically does not circulate in South Africa, which is one of the things that make living so dear there. In all exactly 14 and 9pence. "There, Harry, my boy," I said, "that is the sum total of our worldly wealth. That hole has swallowed all the rest." "By George," said Master Harry. I say, "Father, you and I shall have to let ourselves out to work with the Kaffirs and live on mealy pap." And he sniggered at his unpleasant little joke. But I was in no mood for joking, for it is not a merry thing to dig, like anything for months, and be completely ruined in the process, especially if you happen to dislike digging, and consequently I resented Harry's light-heartedness. "Be quiet, boy," I said, raising my hand as though to give him a cuff, with the result that the half-sovereign slipped out of it and fell into the gulf below. "Oh, bother," said I, "it's gone." "There, Dad," said Harry. "That's what comes of letting your angry passions rise. Now we are down to 4 and 9. I made no answer to these words of wisdom, but scrambled down the steep sides of the claim, followed by Harry, to hunt for my little all. Well, we hunted and we hunted. But the moonlight is an uncertain thing to look for half-sovereigns by, and there was some loose soil about, for the Kaffirs had knocked off working at this very spot a couple of hours before. I took a pick and raked away the clods of earth with it, in the hope of finding the coin, but all in vain. At last, in sheer annoyance, I struck the sharp end of the pickaxe down into the soil, which was of a very hard nature. To my astonishment, it sunk in right up to the haft. "Why, Harry," I said, "this ground must have been disturbed." "I don't think so, father," he answered, "but we will soon see," and he began to shovel out the soil with his hands. "Oh," he said presently, "it's only some old stones. The pick has gone down between them. Look." And he began to pull at one of the stones. "I say, Dad," he said presently, almost in a whisper, "it's precious heavy, feel it." And he rose and gave me a round, brownish lump about the size of a very large apple, which he was holding in both his hands. I took it curiously and held it up to the light. It was very heavy. The moonlight fell upon its rough and filth-encrusted surface, and as I looked, curious little thrills of excitement began to pass through me, but I could not be sure. "Give me your knife, Harry," I said. He did so, and resting the brown stone on my knee, I scratched at its surface. Great heavens! It was soft! Another second, and the secret was out. We had found a great nugget of pure gold, 4 pounds of it or more. "It's gold, lad," I said. "It's gold, or I'm a Dutchman." Harry, with his eyes starting out of his head, glared down at the gleaming yellow scratch that I had made upon the virgin metal, and then burst out into yell upon yell of exultation, which went ringing away across the silent claims like shrieks of somebody being murdered. "Be quiet," I said. "Do you want every thief on the fields after you?" Scarcely were the words out of my mouth when I heard a stealthy footstep approaching. I promptly put the big nugget down and sat on it, and uncommonly hard it was. As I did so, I saw a lean, dark face poked over the edge of the claim, and a pair of beady eyes searching us out. I knew the face. It belonged to a man of very bad character known as Handspike Tom, who had, I understood, been so named at the Diamond Fields because he had murdered his mate with a handspike. He was now no doubt prowling about like a human Hinno to see what he could steal. "Is that you, unto Quatermain?" he said. "Yes, it's I, Mr. Tom," I answered, politely. "And what might all that there yelling be?" he asked. I was walking along, a taking of the evening air, and a thinking on the stars, when I ears owl after owl. "Well, Mr. Tom," I answered, "that is not to be wondered at, seeing that like yourself they are nocturnal birds." "Owl after owl," he repeated sternly, taking no notice of my interpretation, and I stops and says, "That's murder," and I listens again and thinks, "No, it ain't. That owl is the owl of hexaltation. Someone's been and got his fingers into a gummy yellow pot, I'll swear, and gone off, is eed in the sucking of them. Now, unto Quatermain, is I right? Is it nuggets? Oh, law!" And he smacked his lips audibly. "Great big yellow boys. Is it them that you have just been and tumbled across?" "No," I said boldly, "it isn't." The cruel gleam in his black eyes, altogether overcoming my aversion to untruth, for I knew that if once he found out what it was that I was sitting on. "And by the way, I have heard of rolling in gold," being spoken of as a pleasant process, but I certainly do not recommend anybody who values comfort to try sitting on it. I should run a very good chance of being handspiked before the night was over. If you want to know what it was, Mr. Tom, I went on with my politest air, although in agony, from the nugget underneath, for I hold it is always best to be polite to a man who is so ready with a handspike. My boy and I had a slight difference of opinion, and I was enforcing my view of the matter upon him, that's all. Yes, Mr. Tomb, put in Harry, beginning to weep, for Harry was a smart boy, and saw the difficulty we were in. That was it, I hallowed, because father beat me. Well, now, did ye? My dear boy, did ye? Well, all I can say is that a played-out old claim is a wonderful queer sort of place to come to for to argify at 10 o'clock of night. And what's more, my sweet youth, if ever I should, of the argifying of year, and he leered unpleasantly at Harry, ye won't, oller in quite such a jolly sort, oh way. And now I'll be saying good night, for I don't like disturbing of a family party. No, I ain't that sort of man, I ain't. Good night to ye. Unto Quatermain, good night to ye, my argified young one. And Mr. Tom turned away disappointed, and prowled off elsewhere, like a human jackal, to see what he could thieve or kill. Thank goodness, said, as I slipped off the lump of gold. Now, then, do you get up, Harry, and see if that consummate villain has gone. Harry did so, and reported that he had vanished towards Pilgrim's Rest, and then we set to work, and very carefully, but trembling with excitement, with our hands hollowed out all the space of ground into which I had struck the pick. Yes, as I hoped. There was a regular nest of nuggets, 12 in all, running from the size of a hazel, not to that of a hen's egg, though of course the first one was much larger than that. How they all came there nobody can say. It was one of those extraordinary freaks, with stories of which, at any rate, all people acquainted with alluvial gold mining will be familiar. It turned out afterwards that the American who sold me the claim had in the same way made his pile, a much larger one than ours, by the way, out of a single pocket, and then worked for 6 months without seeing colour, after which he gave it up. At any rate, there the nuggets were, to the value, as it turned out afterwards, of about £1,250, so that after all I took out of that hole £450 more than I put into it. We got them all out and wrapped them up in a handkerchief, and then, fearing to carry home so much treasure, especially as we knew that Mr. Handspike Tom was on the prowl, made up our minds to pass the night where we were, a necessity which, disagreeable as it was wonderfully sweetened by the presence of that handkerchief full of virgin gold, the interest of my lost half-sovereign. Slowly the night wore away, for with the fear of Handspike Tom before my eyes I did not dare to go to sleep, and at last the dawn came. I got up and watched its growth, till it opened like a flower upon the eastern sky, and the sunbeams began to spring up in splendour from mountain top to mountain top. I watched it, and as I did so it flashed upon me, with a complete conviction which I had not felt before, that I had had enough of gold, mining to last me the rest of my natural life, and I then and there made up my mind to clear out of Pilgrim's Rest, and go and shoot buffalo towards Delagoa Bay. Then I turned, took the pick and shovel, and although it was a Sunday morning, woke up Harry and set to work to see if there were any more nuggets about. As I expected, there were none. What we had got had lain together in a little pocket filled with soil that felt quite different from the stuff round, and outside the pocket there was not another trace of gold. Of course, it is possible that there were more pocketfuls somewhere about. But all I have to say is I made up my mind that, whoever found them, I should not, and as a matter of fact. I have since heard that this claim has been the ruin of 2 or 3 people, as it very nearly was the ruin of me. "Harry," I said presently, "I am going away this week towards Delagoa to shoot buffalo. Shall I take you with me, or send you down to Durban?" "Oh, take me with you, father," begged Harry. "I want to kill a buffalo." "And supposing that the buffalo kills you instead?" I asked. "Oh, never mind," he said gaily. "There are lots more where I came from." I rebuked him for his flippancy, but in the end I consented to take him. Chapter 2. What was found in the pool. Something over a fortnight had passed since the night when I lost half a sovereign and found £1,250 in looking for it, and instead of that horrid hole, for which, after all, El Dorado was hardly a misnomer. A very different scene stretched away before us, clad in the silver robe of the moonlight. We were camped, Harry and I, 2 Kaffirs, a Scotch cart, and 6 oxen, on the swelling side of a great wave of bush-clad land. Just where we had made our camp, however, the bush was very sparse, and only grew about in clumps, while here and there were single flat, topped mimosa trees. To our right a little stream, which had cut a deep channel for itself in the bosom of the slope, flowered musically on between banks green with made hair, wild asparagus, and many beautiful grasses. The bedrock here was red granite, and in the course of centuries of patient washing the water had hollowed out some of the huge slabs in its path into great troughs and cups, and these we used for bathing places. No Roman lady, with her baths of porphyry or alabaster, could have had a more delicious spot to bathe herself than we found within 50 yards of our skerm, or rough enclosure of mimosa thorn, that we had dragged together round the cart to protect us from the attacks of lions. That there were several of these brutes about, I knew from their spoor, though we had neither heard nor seen them. Our bath was a little nook where the eddy of the stream had washed away a mass of soil, and on the edge of it there grew a most beautiful old mimosa thorn. Beneath the thorn was a large smooth slab of granite, fringed all round with made hair and other ferns, that sloped gently down to a pool of the clearest sparkling water, which lay in a bowl of granite about 10 feet wide by 5 feet deep in the centre. Here to this slab we went every morning to bathe, and that delightful bath is among the most pleasant of my hunting reminiscences, as it is also, for reasons which will presently appear, among the most painful. It was a lovely night. Harry and I sat to the windward of the fire, where the 2 Kaffirs were busily employed in cooking some impala steaks off a buck which Harry, to his great joy, had shot that morning, and were as perfectly contented with ourselves and the world at large as 2 people could possibly be. The night was beautiful, and it would require somebody with more words on the tip of his tongue than I have to describe properly the chastened majesty of those moonlit wilds. Away for ever and for ever, away to the mysterious north, rolled the great bush ocean over which the silence brooded. There beneath us a mile, or more to the right ran the wide Oliphant, and mirror, like flashed back the moon, whose silver spears were shivered on its breast, and then tossed in twisted lines of light far and wide about the mountains and the plain. Down upon the river banks grew great timber, trees that through the stillness pointed solemnly to heaven, and the beauty of the night lay upon like a cloud. Everywhere was silence, silence in the starred depths, silence on the bosom of the sleeping earth. Now, if ever great thoughts might rise in a man's mind, and for a space he might forget his littleness in the sense that he partook of the pure immensity about him. Hark! What was that? From far away, down by the river, there comes a mighty rolling sound. Then, and another. It is the lion seeking his meat. I saw Harry shiver and turn a little pale. He was a plucky boy enough. But the roar of a lion heard for the first time in the solemn bush veldt at night is apt to shake the nerves of any lad. "Lions, my boy," I said. "They are hunting down by the river there, but I don't think that you need make yourself uneasy. We have been here 3 nights now, and if they were going to pay us a visit, I think that they would have done so before this. However, we will make up the fire. Here, Pharaoh, do you and Jim get some more wood before we go to sleep, else the cats will be purring round you before morning." Pharaoh, a great brawny Swazi, who had been working for me at Pilgrim's Rest, laughed, rose, and stretched himself, then calling to Jim to bring the axe and a ream, started off in the moonlight towards a clump of sugar bush where we cut our fuel from some dead trees. He was a fine fellow in his way, was Pharaoh, and I think that he had been named Pharaoh because he had an Egyptian cast of countenance and a royal sort of swagger about him. But his way was a somewhat peculiar way, on account of the uncertainty of his temper, and very few people could get on with him. Also, if he could find liquor, he would drink like a fish, and when he drank, he became shockingly bloodthirsty. These were his bad points. His good ones were that, like most people of the Zulu blood, he became exceedingly attached if he took to you at all. He was a hard-working and intelligent man, and about as daredevil and plucky a fellow at a pinch as I have ever had to do with. He was about 35 years of age or so, but not a Keshler or Ringed man. I believe that he had got into trouble in some way in Swaziland, and the authorities of his tribe would not allow him to assume the ring, and that is why he came to work at the goldfields. The other man, or rather lad, Jim, was a Mapok Kaffir, or Knobnose, and even in the light of subsequent events I fear I cannot speak very well of him. He was an idle and careless young rascal, and only that very morning I had to tell Pharaoh to give him a beating for letting the oxen stray, which Pharaoh did with the greatest gusto, although he was by way of being very fond of Jim. Indeed, I saw him consoling Jim afterwards with a pinch of snuff from his own ear box, whilst he explained to him that the next time it came in the way of duty to flog him. He meant to thrash him with the other hand, so as to cross the old cuts and make a pretty pattern on his back. Well, off they went, though Jim did not at all like leaving the camp at that hour, even when the moonlight was so bright, and in due course returned safely enough with a great bundle of wood. I laughed at Jim, and asked him if he had seen anything, and he said yes, he had. He had seen 2 large yellow eyes staring at him from behind a bush, and heard something snore, as, however, on further investigation, the yellow eyes and the snore appeared to have existed only in Jim's lively imagination. I was not greatly disturbed by this alarming report, but having seen to the making up of the fire, I got into the skirm and went quietly to sleep with Harry by my side. Some hours afterwards I woke up with a start. I don't know what woke me. The moon had gone down, or at least was almost hidden behind the soft horizon of bush, only her red rim being visible. Also a wind had sprung up and was driving long, hurrying lines of cloud across the starry sky, and altogether a great change had come over the mood of the night. By the look of the sky, I judged that we must be about 2 hours from daybreak. The oxen, which were as usual tied to Disselboom of the Scotch cart, were very restless. They kept snuffling and blowing, and rising up and lying down again, so I at once suspected that they must wind something. Presently I knew what it was that they winded, for within 50 yards of us a lion roared, not very loud, but quite loud enough to make my heart come into my mouth. Pharaoh was sleeping on the other side of the cart, and, looking beneath it, I saw him raise his head and listen.
Lion!
Inkoos, he whispered.
Lion!
Jim also jumped up, and by the faint light I could see that he was in a very great fright indeed. Thinking that it was as well to be prepared for emergencies, I told Pharaoh to throw wood upon the fire, and woke up Harry, who I verily believe was capable of sleeping happily through the crack of doom. He was a little scared at first, but presently the excitement of the position came home to him, and he grew quite anxious to see His Majesty face to face. I got my rifle handy and gave Harry his, a Westley Richards falling block, which is a very useful gun for a youth, being light and yet a good killing rifle, and then we waited. For a long time nothing happened, and I began to think that the best thing we could do would be to go to sleep again, when suddenly I heard a sound more like a cough than a roar within about 20 yards of the skirm. We all looked out, but could see nothing, and then followed another period of suspense. It was very trying to the nerves, this waiting for an attack that might be developed from any quarter, or might not be developed at all. And though I was an old hand at this sort of business, I was anxious about Harry, for it is wonderful how the presence of anybody to whom one is attached unnerves a man in moments of danger. I know, although it was now chilly enough, I could feel the perspiration running down my nose, and in order to relieve the strain on my attention, employed myself in watching a beetle which appeared to be attracted by the firelight, and was sitting before it thoughtfully rubbing his antennae against each other. Suddenly, the beetle gave such a jump that he nearly pitched headlong into the fire, and so did we all, gave jumps, and no wonder, for from right under the skirm fence there came a most frightful roar, a roar that literally made the Scotch cart shake, and took the breath out of me. Harry made an exclamation, Jim howled outright, while the poor oxen, who were terrified almost out of their hides, shivered and lowed piteously. The night was almost entirely dark now, for the moon had quite set, and the clouds had covered up the stars, so that the only light we had came from the fire, which by this time was burning up brightly again. But, as you know, firelight is absolutely useless to shoot by. It is so uncertain, and besides, it penetrates, but a very little way into the darkness. Although if one is in the dark outside, one can see it from far away. Presently the oxen, after standing still for a moment, suddenly winded the lion and did what I feared they would do, began to skrek, that is, to try and break loose from the trektoe to which they were tied, to rush off madly into the wilderness. Lions know of this habit on the part of oxen, which are, I do believe, the most foolish animals under the sun, a sheep being a very Solomon compared to them, and it is by no means uncommon for a lion to get in such a position that a herd or span of oxen may wind him, skrek, break their reins, and rush off into the bush. Of course, once there, they are helpless in the dark, and then the lion chooses the one that he loves best and eats him at his leisure. Well, round and round went our 6 poor oxen, nearly trampling us to death in their mad rush. Indeed, had we not hastily tumbled out of the way, we should have been trodden to death, or at the least seriously injured. As it was, Harry was run over, and poor Jim being caught by the trektoe somewhere beneath the arm, was hurled right across the skerm, landing by my side only some paces off. Snap went the diselbum of the cart beneath the transverse strain put upon it. Had it not broken, the cart would have overset. As it was, in another minute, oxen, cart, trektoe, reams, broken diselbum, and everything was soon tied in one vast heving, plunging, bellowing, and seemingly inextricable knot. For a moment or two this state of affairs took my attention off from the lion that had caused it. But whilst I was wondering what on earth was to be done next, and how we should manage if the cattle broke loose into the bush and were lost, for cattle frightened in this manner will so straight away like mad things, my thoughts were suddenly recalled to the lion in a very painful fashion. For at that moment I perceived by the light of the fire a kind of gleam of yellow travelling through the air towards us. "The lion! The lion!" holloed Pharaoh, and as he did so, he, or rather she, for it was a great gaunt lioness, half wild no doubt with hunger, lit right in the middle of the skerm, and stood there in the smoky gloom, lashing her tail and roaring. I seized my rifle and fired it at her, but what between the confusion, my agitation, and the uncertain light, I missed her and nearly shot Pharaoh. The flash of the rifle, however, threw the whole scene into strong relief, and a wild sight it was, I can tell you, with the seething mass of oxen twisted all round the cart, in such a fashion that their heads looked as though they were growing out of their rumps, and their horns seemed to protrude from their backs. The smoking fire with just a blaze in the heart of the smoke, Jim in the foreground, where the oxen had thrown him in their wild rush, stretched out there in terror, and then, as a centre to the picture, the great gaunt lioness glaring round with hungry yellow eyes, roaring and whining as she made up her mind what to do. It did not take her long, however, just the time that it takes a flash to die into darkness, for before I could fire again or do anything, with a most fiendish snort, she sprang upon poor Jim. I heard the unfortunate lad shriek, and then almost instantly I saw his legs thrown into the air. The lioness had seized him by the neck, and with a sudden jerk thrown his body over her back, so that his legs hung down upon the further side. Then, without the slightest hesitation, and apparently without any difficulty, she cleared the skerm face at a single bound, and bearing poor Jim Jim with her vanished into the darkness beyond, in the direction of the bathing place that I have already described. We jumped up perfectly mad with horror and fear, and rushed wildly after her, firing shots at haphazard on the chance that she would be frightened by them into dropping her prey, but nothing could we see, and nothing could we hear. The lioness had vanished into the darkness, taking Jim with her, and to attempt to follow her till daylight was madness. We should only expose ourselves to the risk of a like fate. So with scared and heavy hearts we crept back to the skerm, and sat down to wait for the dawn, which now could not be much more than an hour off. It was absolutely useless to try even to disentangle the oxen till then, so all that was left for us to do was to sit and wonder how it came to pass that the one should be taken and the other left, and to hope against hope that our poor servant might have been mercifully delivered from the lion's jaws. At length the faint dawn came stealing like a ghost up the long slope of bush, and glinted on the tangled oxen's horns, and with white and frightened faces we got up, and set to the task of disentangling the oxen, until such time as there should be light enough to enable us to follow the trail of the lioness, which had gone off with Jim. And here a fresh trouble awaited us, for when at last, with infinite difficulty, we had disentangled the great helpless brutes, it was only to find that one of the best of them was very sick. There was no mistake about the way he stood with his legs slightly apart and his head hanging down. He had got the red water, I was sure of it. Of all the difficulties connected with life and travelling in South Africa, those connected with oxen are perhaps the worst. The ox is the most exasperating animal in the world, a Negro excepted. He has absolutely no constitution, and never neglects an opportunity of falling sick of some mysterious disease. He will get thin upon the slightest provocation, and from mere maliciousness die of poverty. Whereas it his chief delight to turn round and refuse to pull whenever he finds himself well in the centre of a river, or the wagon will nicely fast in a mud hole. Drive him a few miles over rough roads, and you will find that he is footsore. Turn him loose to feed, and you will discover that he has run away, or if he has not run away, he has of malice aforethought eaten, tulip and poisoned himself. There is always something with him. The ox is a brute. It was of a piece with his accustomed behaviour for the one in question to break out, on purpose probably, with Redwater just when a lion had walked off with his herd. It was exactly what I should have expected, and I was therefore neither disappointed nor surprised. Well, it was no use crying as I should almost have liked to do, because if this ox had Redwater it was probable that the rest of them had it too, although they had been sold to me as salted. That is, proof against such diseases as Redwater and lungsick. One gets hardened to this sort of thing in South Africa in course of time. For I suppose in no other country in the world is the waste of animal life so great. So taking my rifle and telling Harry to follow me, for we had to leave Farrow to look after the oxen, Farrow's lean kine, I called them. I started to see if anything could be found of or appertaining to the unfortunate Jim. The ground round our little camp was hard and rocky, and we could not hit off any spoor of the lioness, though just outside the skerm was a drop or two of blood, about 300 yards from the camp, and a little to the right was a patch of sugar bush mixed up with the usual mimosa. And for this I made, thinking that the lioness would have been sure to take her prey there to devour it. On we pushed through the long grass that was bent down beneath the weight of the soaking dew. In 2 minutes we were wet through up to the thighs, as wet as though we had waded through water. In due course, however, we reached the patch of bush, and by the grey light of the morning cautiously and slowly pushed our way into it. It was very dark under the trees, for the sun was not yet up, so we walked with the most extreme care, half expecting every minute to come across the lioness, licking the bones of poor Jim Jim. But no lioness could we see, and as for Jim Jim, there was not even a finger joint of him to be found. Evidently they had not come here. So pushing through the bush we proceeded to hunt every other likely spot, but with the same result. I suppose she must have taken him right away, I said at last, sadly enough. At any rate he will be dead by now, so God have mercy on him. We can't help him. What's to be done now? I suppose that we had better wash ourselves in the pool, and then go back and get something to eat. I am filthy, said Harry. This was a practical, if a somewhat unfeeling suggestion. At least it struck me as unfeeling to talk of washing when poor Jim Jim had been so recently eaten. However, I did not let my sentiment carry me away. So we went down to the beautiful spot that I have described to wash. I was the first to reach it, which I did by scrambling down the ferny bank. Then I turned round and started back with a yell, as well I might, for almost from beneath my feet there came a most awful snarl. I had lit nearly upon the back of the lioness, that had been sleeping on the slab, where we always stood to dry ourselves after bathing. With a snarl and a growl, before I could do anything, before I could even cock my rifle, she had bounded right across the crystal pool and vanished over the opposite bank. It was all done in an instant, as quick as thought. She had been sleeping on the slab, and oh, horror! What was that sleeping beside her? It was the red remains of poor Jim Jim, lying on a patch of blood-stained rock. "Oh, father, father!" shrieked Harry. "Look in the water." I looked. There, floating in the centre of the lovely tranquil pool, was Jim Jim's head. The lioness had bitten it right off, and it had rolled down the sloping rock into the water. Chapter 3. Jim Jim is Avenged. We never bathed in that pool again. Indeed, for my part, I could never look at its peaceful purity fringed round, with waving ferns without thinking of that ghastly head which rolled itself off through the water when we tried to catch it. Poor Jim Jim. We buried what was left of him, which was not very much, in an old bread bag, and though whilst he lived his virtues were not great, now that he was gone we could have wept over him. Indeed, Harry did weep outright, while Farah used very bad language in Zulu. And I registered a quiet little vow on my account that I would let daylight into that lioness before I was 48 hours older, if by any means it could be done. Well, we buried him, and there he lies in the bread bag, which I rather grudged him, as it was the only one we had. Where lions will not trouble him any more, though perhaps the Hinnas will, if they consider that there is enough on him left to make worth their while to dig him up. However, he won't mind that. So there is an end of the book of Jim Jim. The question that now remained was, how to circumvent his murderess. I knew that she would be sure to return as soon as she was hungry again. But I did not know when she would be hungry. She had left so little of Jim behind her that I should scarcely expect to see her the next night, unless indeed she had cubs. Still, I felt that it would not be wise to miss the chance of her coming. So we set about making preparations for her reception. The first thing that we did was to strengthen the bush wall of the skerm by dragging a large quantity of the tops of thorn trees together, and laying them one on the other in such a fashion that the thorns pointed outwards. This, after our experience of the fate of Jim, seemed a very necessary precaution, since if where one goat can jump another can follow, as the Kaffirs say, how much more is this the case when an animal so active and so vigorous as the lion is concerned? And now came the further question. How were we to beguile the lioness to return? Lions are animals that have a strange knack of appearing when they are not wanted, and keeping studiously out of the way when their presence is required. Of course, it was possible that if she had found Jim to her liking, she would come back to see if there were any more of his kind about, but still it was not to be relied on. Harry, who as I have said was an eminently practical boy, suggested to Farah that he should go and sit outside the skerm in the moonlight as a sort of bait, assuring him that he would have nothing to fear, as we should certainly kill the lioness before she killed him. Farah, however, strangely enough, did not seem to take to this suggestion. Indeed, he walked away, much put out with Harry for having made it. It gave me an idea, however. "By Jove," I said, "there is the sick ox. He must die sooner or later, so we may as well utilize him." Now, about 30 yards to the left of our skerm, as one stood facing down the hill towards the river, was the stump of a tree that had been destroyed by lightning many years before, standing equidistant between, but a little in front of, 2 clumps of bush, which were severally some 15 paces from it. Here was the very place to tie the ox, and accordingly a little before sunset, the sick animal was led forth by Farah, and made fast there, little knowing, poor brute, for what purpose, and we began our long vigil, this time without a fire. For our object was to attract the lioness and not to scare her. For hour after hour we waited, keeping ourselves awake by pinching each other. It is, by the way, remarkable what a difference of opinion as to the force of pinches requisite to the occasion exists in the mind of pincher and pinched. But no lioness came. At last the moon went down, and darkness swallowed up the world, as the Kaffirs say, but no lions came to swallow us up. We waited till dawn, because we did not dare to go to sleep. And then at last, with many bad thoughts in our hearts, we took such rest as we could get, and that was not much. That morning we went out shooting, not because we wanted to, for we were too depressed and tired, but because we had no more meat. For 3 hours or more we wandered about in a broiling sun, looking for something to kill, but with absolutely no results. For some unknown reason the game had grown very scarce about the spot, though when I was there 2 years before every sort of large game except rhinoceros and elephant was particularly abundant. The lions, of whom there were many, alone remained, and I fancy that it was the fact of the game they live on, having temporarily migrated, which made them so daring and ferocious. As a general rule, a lion is an amiable animal enough if he is left alone, but a hungry lion is almost as dangerous as a hungry man. One hears a great many different opinions, expressed as to whether or no the lion is remarkable for his courage. But the result of my experience is that very much depends upon the state of his stomach. A hungry lion will not stick at a trifle, whereas a full one will flee at a very small rebuke. Well, we hunted all about, and nothing could we see, not even a duiker or a bushbuck, and at last, thoroughly tired and out of temper, we started on our way back to camp, passing over the brow of a steepish hill to do so. Just as we climbed the crest of the ridge, I came to a stand, for there, about 600 yards to my left, his beautiful curved horns outlined against the soft blue of the sky, I saw a noble kudu bull, Strepsiceros kudu, even at that distance. For as you know, my eyes are very keen. I could distinctly see the white stripes on its side when the light fell upon it, and its large and pointed ears twitch as the flies worried it. So far so good, but how were we to get at it? It was ridiculous to risk a shot at that great distance, and yet both the ground and the wind lay very ill for stalking. It seemed to me that the only chance would be to make a detour of at least a mile or more, and come up on the other side of the kudu. I called Harry to my side, and explained to him what I thought would be our best course, when suddenly, without any delay, the kudu saved us further trouble by suddenly starting off down the hill like a leaping rocket. I do not know what had frightened it. Certainly we had not. Perhaps a hyena or a leopard, a tiger as we call it there, had suddenly appeared. At any rate, off it went, running slightly towards us, and I never saw a buck go faster. I am afraid that forgetting Harry's presence, I used strong language, and really there was some excuse. As for Harry, he stood watching the beautiful animal's course. Presently it vanished behind a patch of bush, to emerge a few seconds later about 500 paces from us, on a stretch of comparatively level ground that was strewn with boulders. On it went, clearing the boulders in its path, with a succession of great bounds that were beautiful to behold. As it did so, I happened to look round at Harry, and perceived to my astonishment that he had got his rifle to his shoulder. "You young donkey!" I exclaimed. "Surely you are not going to?" And just at that moment the rifle went off. And then I think I saw what was in its way one of the most wonderful things I ever remember in my hunting experience. The kudu was at the moment in the air, clearing a pile of stones with its 4 legs tucked up underneath it. All of an instant the legs stretched themselves out in a spasmodic fashion. It lit on them, and they doubled up beneath it. Down went the noble buck, down upon his head. For a moment he seemed to be standing on his horns, his hind legs high in the air, and then over he rolled and lay still. "Great heavens!" I said. "Why, you've hit him!" "He's dead." As for Harry, he said nothing, but merely looked scared, as well he might, for such a marvellous, I may say such an appalling and ghastly fluke it has never been my lot to witness. A man, let alone a boy, might have fired 1,000 shots with ever touching the object, which, mind you, was springing and bounding over rocks quite 500 yards away, and here this lad, taking a snapshot, and merely allowing for speed and elevation by instinct, for he did not put up his sights, had knocked the bull over as dead as a door-nail. Well, I made no further remark, as the occasion was too solemn for talking, but merely led the way to where the kudu had fallen. There he lay, a beautiful and quite still, and there, high up, about halfway down his neck, was a neat round hole. The bullet had severed the spinal marrow, passing through the vertebra and away on the other side. It was already evening when, having cut as much of the best meat as we could carry from the bull, and tied a red handkerchief and some tufts of grass to his spiral horns, which, by the way, must have been nearly 5 feet in length, in the hope of keeping the jackals and asvigels, vultures, from him, we finally got back to camp to find Pharaoh, who was getting rather anxious at our absence, ready to greet us with the pleasing intelligence that another ox was sick. But even this dreadful bit of intelligence could not dash Harry's spirits. The fact of the matter being, incredible as it may appear, I do verily believe that in his heart of hearts he set down the death of the kudu to the credit of his own skill. Now, though the lad was a pretty shot enough, this of course was ridiculous, and I told him so plainly. By the time that we had finished our supper of kudu steaks, which would have been better if the kudu had been a little younger, it was time to get ready for Jim's murderess. Accordingly, we determined again to expose the unfortunate sick ox. That was now absolutely on its last legs, being indeed scarcely able to stand. All the afternoon, Pharaoh told us it had been walking round and round in a circle, as cattle in the last stage of Redwater generally do. Now it had come to a standstill, and was swaying to and from with its head hanging down. So we tied him up to the stump of the tree as on the previous night, knowing that if the lioness did not kill him, he would be dead by morning. Indeed, I was afraid that he would die at once, in which case he would be of but little use as a bait. For the lion is a sportsmanlike animal, and unless he is very hungry generally prefers to kill his own dinner. Though when that is once killed he will come back to it again and again. Then we again went through our experience of the previous night, sitting there hour after hour, till at last Harry fell fast asleep, and, though I am accustomed to this sort of thing, even I could scarcely keep my eyes open. Indeed, I was just dropping off, when suddenly Pharaoh gave me a push.
Listen,
he whispered. I was awake in a second, and listening with all my ears. From the clump of bush to the right of the lightning, shattered stump to which the sick ox tied came a faint crackling noise. Presently it was repeated. Something was moving there, faintly and quietly enough, but still moving perceptibly, for in the intense stillness of the night any sound seemed loud. I woke up Harry, who instantly said, "Where is she? Where is she?" and began to point his rifle about in a fashion that was more dangerous to us and the oxen than to any possible lioness. "Be quiet," I whispered savagely, and as I did so, with a low and hideous growl a flash of yellow light sped out of the clump of bush, past the ox, and into the corresponding clump upon the other side. The poor sick creature gave a sort of groan, staggered round, and then began to tremble. I could see it do so clearly in the moonlight, which was now very bright, and I felt a brute for having exposed the unfortunate animal to such agony as he must undoubtedly be undergoing. The lioness, for it was she, passed so quickly that we could not even distinguish her movements, much less fire. Indeed, at night it is absolutely useless. To attempt to shoot object is very close, and standing perfectly still. And then the light is so deceptive, and it is so difficult to see the foresight that the best shot will miss more often than he hits. "She will be back again presently," I said. "Look out, but for heaven's sake don't fire unless I tell you to." Hardly were the words out of my mouth when back she came, and again past the ox without striking him. "What on earth is she doing?" whispered Harry. "Playing with it as a cat does with a mouse, I suppose. She will kill it presently." As I spoke, the lioness once more flashed out of the bush, and this time sprang right over the doomed and trembling ox. It was a beautiful sight to see her clear him in the bright moonlight, as though it were a trick which she had been taught. "I believe that she has escaped from a circus," whispered Harry. "It's jolly to see her jump." I said nothing, but I thought to myself that if it was, Master Harry did not quite appreciate the performance, and small blame to him. At any rate, his teeth were chattering a little. Then came a longish pause, and I began to think that the lioness must have gone away, when suddenly she appeared again, and with one mighty bound landed right onto the ox, and struck it a frightful blow with her paw. Down it went, and lay on the ground, kicking feebly. She put down her wicked-looking head, and, with a fierce growl of contentment, buried her long white teeth in the throat of the dying animal. When she lifted her muzzle again, it was all stained with blood. She stood facing us obliquely, licking her bloody chops and making a sort of purring noise. "Now's our time," I whispered. "Fire when I do." I got on to her as well as I could, but Harry, instead of waiting for me, as I told him, fired before I did, and that, of course, hurried me. But when the smoke cleared, I was delighted to see that the lioness was rolling about on the ground behind the body of the ox, which covered her in such a fashion, however, that we could not shoot again to make an end of her.
"She's done for! She's dead! The yellow devil!"
yelled Pharaoh in exultation, and at that very moment the lioness, with a sort of convulsive rush, half rolled, half sprang, into the patch of thick bush to the right. I fired after her as she went, but so far as I could see without result. Indeed, the probability is that I missed her clean. At any rate, she got to the bush in safety, and once there, I began to make such a diabolical noise as I never heard before. She would whine and shriek with pain, and then burst out into perfect volleys of roaring that shook the whole place. "Well," I said, "we must just let her roar. To go into that bush after her at night would be madness." At that moment, to my astonishment and alarm, there came an answering roar from the direction of the river, and then another from behind the swell of bush. Evidently there were more lions about. The wounded lioness redoubled her efforts, with the object, I suppose, of summoning the others to her assistance. At any rate they came, and quickly too. For within 5 minutes, peeping through the bushes of our skirm fence, we saw a magnificent lion bounding along towards us, through the tall tambuki grass that in the moonlight looked for all the world like ripening corn. On he came in great leaps, and a glorious sight it was to see him. When within 50 yards or so, he stood still in an open space and roared. The lioness roared too. Then there came a third roar, and another great black, maned lion stalked majestically up, and joined number 2, until really I began to realize what the ox must have undergone. "Now, Harry," I whispered, "whatever you do, don't fire. It's too risky. If they let us be." let them be. Well, the pair marched off to the bush, where the wounded lioness was now roaring double tides, and the three of them began to snarl and grumble away together there. Presently, however, the lioness ceased roaring, and the two lions came out again. The black-maned one first, to prospect, I suppose, walked to where the carcass of the ox lay, and sniffed at it.
"Oh, what a shot!"
whispered Harry, who was trembling with excitement. "Yes," I said, "but don't fire, they might all of them come for us." Harry said nothing. But whether it was from the natural impetuosity of youth, or because he was thrown off his balance by excitement, or from sheer recklessness and devilment, I am sure I cannot tell you, never having been able to get a satisfactory explanation from him. But at any rate the fact remains, he, without word or warning, entirely disregarding my exhortations, lifted up his Wesley Richards and fired at the black-maned lion, and, what is more, hit it slightly on the flank. The next second there was a most awful roar from the injured lion. He glared around him and roared with pain, for he was badly stung, and then, before I could make up my mind what to do, the great black-maned brute, clearly ignorant of the cause of his hurt, sprang right at the throat of his companion, to whom he evidently attributed his misfortune. It was a curious sight to see the astonishment of the other lion at this most unprovoked assault. Over he rolled with an angry snarl, and onto him sprang the black-maned demon, and began to worry him. This finally awoke the yellow-maned lion to a sense of the situation, and I am bound to say that he rose to it in a most effective manner. Somehow or other he got to his feet, and, roaring and snarling frightfully, closed with his mighty foe. Then ensued a most tremendous scene. You know what a shocking thing it is to see two large dogs fighting with abandonment. Well, a whole 100 of dogs could not have looked half so terrible as those two great brutes as they rolled and roared and rent in their horrid rage. They gripped each other, they tore at each other's throat, till their manes came out in handfuls, and the red blood streamed down their yellow hides. It was an awful and a wonderful thing to see the great cats tearing at each other with all the fierce energy of their savage strength, and making the night hideous with their heart-shaking noise. And the fight was a grand one too. For some minutes it was impossible to say which was getting the best of it, but at last I saw that the black-maned lion, though he was slightly bigger, was failing. I am inclined to think that the wound in his flank crippled him. Anyway, he began to get the worst of it, which served him right, as he was the aggressor. Still I could not help feeling sorry for him, for he had fought a gallant fight. When his antagonist finally got him by the throat, and struggle, and strike out as he would, began to shake the life out of him. Over and over they rolled together, a hideous and awe-inspiring spectacle, but the yellow one would not loose his hold. And at length poor Black-Mane grew faint, his breath came in great snorts, and seemed to rattle in his nostrils. Then he opened his huge mouth, gave the ghost of a roar, quivered, and was dead, when he was quite sure that the victory was his own. The yellow-maned lion loosed his grip and sniffed at the fallen foe. Then he licked the dead lion's eye, and next, with his 4 feet resting on the carcass, sent up his own chant of victory, that went rolling and pealing down the dark paths of the night. And at this point I interfered. taking a careful sight at the centre of his body. In order to give the largest possible margin for error, I fired and sent a 5070 express bullet right through him, and down he dropped dead upon the carcass of his mighty foe. After that, fairly satisfied with our performances, we slept peaceably till dawn, leaving Farah to keep watch in case any more lions should take it into their heads to come our way. When the sun was well up, we arose and went very cautiously. At least Farah and I did, for I would not allow Harry to come, to see if we could find any trace of the wounded lioness. She had ceased roaring immediately upon the arrival of the two lions, and had not made a sound since, from which we concluded that she was probably dead. I was armed with my express, while Pharaoh, in whose hands a rifle was indeed a dangerous weapon, to his companions had an axe. On our way we stopped to look at the two dead lions. They were magnificent animals, both of them, but their pelts were entirely spoiled by the terrible mauling they had given to each other, which was a sad pity. In another minute we were following the blood spoor of the wounded lioness into the bush, where she had taken refuge. This, I need hardly say, we did with the utmost caution. Indeed, I for one did not at all like the job, and was only consoled by the reflection that it was necessary, and that the bush was not thick. Well, we stood there, keeping as far from the trees as possible, searching and looking about. But no lioness could we see, though we saw plenty of blood. She must have gone somewhere to die. Pharaoh, I said in Zulu. Yes, Inkus, he answered. She has certainly gone away. Hardly were the words out of his mouth when I heard a roar, and starting round saw the lioness emerge from the very centre of a bush in which she had been curled up, just behind Pharaoh. Up she went onto her hind legs, and as she did so I noticed that one of her forepaws was broken near the shoulder, for it hung limply down. Up she went, towering right over Pharaoh's head, as she did so lifting her uninjured paw to strike him to the earth. And then, before I could get my rifle round, or do anything to avert the oncoming catastrophe, the Zulu did a very brave and clever thing. Realizing his own imminent danger, he bounded to one side, and swinging the heavy axe round his head, brought it down right on to the back of the lioness, severing the vertebrae and killing her instantaneously. It was wonderful to see her collapse all in a heap like an empty sack. "My word, Pharaoh!" I said. That was well done, and none too soon. "Yes," he answered, with a little laugh. "It was a good stroke, Inkos. Jim will sleep better now." Then, calling Harry to us, we examined the lioness. She was old, if one might judge from her worn teeth, and not very large, but thickly made, and must have possessed extraordinary vitality to have lived so long, shot as she was, for, in addition to her broken shoulder, my express bullet had blown a great hole in her middle that one might have put a fist into. Well, that is the story of the death of poor Jim, and how we avenged it. It is rather interesting in its way, because of the fight between the two lions, of which I never saw the like in all my experience, and I know something of lions and their manners. "And how did you get back to Pilgrim's Rest?" I asked Hunter Quatermain when he had finished his yarn. "Ah, we had a nice job with that," he answered. "The second sick ox have died, and so did another. And we had to get on as best we could with 3 harnessed unicorn fashion while we pushed behind. We did about 4 miles a day, And it took us nearly a month, during the last week of which we pretty well starved. I notice, I said, that most of your trips ended in disaster of some sort or another, and yet you went on making them, which strikes one as a little strange. Yes, I dare say. But then, remember, I got my living for many years out of hunting. Besides, half the charm of the thing lay in the dangers and disasters, though they were terrible enough at the time. Another thing is, my trips were not all disastrous. Sometime, if you like, I will tell you a story of one which was very much the reverse, for I made several £1,000s out of it, and saw one of the most extraordinary sights a hunter ever came across. It was on this trip that I met the bravest native woman I ever knew. Her name was Maiwa. But it is too late now, and besides, I am tired of talking about myself. Pass the water, will you? The end of this wonderful story. And so, our journey through this timeless fiction comes to an end. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. For more golden tales like this one, feel free to explore the playlists on our channel.